feel ghosted.
What an interesting idea.
You know, I find that kind of silly. I really do. Nobody get to ghost me. In fact, I was thinking, I was looking at the tapes for this class, and I was thinking about some of the things we're saying. And so one of my veg moments is watching The View. I mean, that's the craziest show ever. Really silly. But Whoopi Goldberg had on a T-shirt, and that T-shirt says, "I never lose. Sometimes I win or I learn, but I never lose." And I thought, how profound.
Yeah, that's right. That's the ethos of anybody who believes in lifelong learning, right?
Yes, she's saying she never, situations that do not turn out optimal or that are not optimized, they're not losing situations, they're just learning situations. And I believe from teaching that, you know, you must make mistakes, because if you don't make mistakes, how are you going to get experience? And from that experience, you're going to get knowledge. And then repetitively, you gain wisdom. So it's all positive.
Yes.
Well, all the women that I know with $1 billion or more are clearly smarter than I am.
Well, that's quite an admission.
Whoopi didn't have too many bad moments because she accumulated a large fortune.
Yes, she did, but that show on The View it revolves around her. When she's not there, the ratings are not that high. And when you listen to her very beginnings, Whoopi's not her real name. Neither is Goldberg.
No.
Neither is Goldberg. I think her name is Elaine Johnson, right? And but what I like is her operational philosophy, and sometimes she passes it on to the younger women on the show.
And Nietzsche never went quite that far. He what does not kill me makes me stronger, but there's always that possibility that you might get the killing effect.
Well, you know, it was also an oversimplification because many things that don't kill us leave us crippled. So, I mean, you know, there's plenty of experiences in life that don't leave us any stronger.
but do you know that that's a pop song? I forget who sings it. You know, what doesn't kill you make you stronger. And I happen to like it, but some things can be quite a beatdown. And that's when you decide, well, what am I going to do with this?
Yes.
So what paragraph are you at today?
Well, we're at the point where the Greeks had discovered reason and logos and all that. Practical matters and how the important things in life, and yet they looked back across the gulf of time to the mythological age and thought, what were those dudes smoking?
Hi, Jenny. Jenny is my buddy now, guys.
Yeah, we've frequented some restaurants. Yeah, some delicious food Sharon has introduced me to in this part of the neck of the woods here. Oh, Rick, you look so different. What, you have a different look, Rick.
My hair's down.
Your hair is down.
I have
a lot of ponytail. No ponytail.
Yes, and all this down here looks very blooming. It's blooming.
Yeah, days when I've been walking around and exercising, I have to put it up because I get too hot. I can't have it on my neck. But I've been quiet all morning. I can leave it down. And it's winter, so it'll be down more for the winter.
Jenny, we're going to have 45 degrees tomorrow.
I know. We're going to be in shock, Rick. I mean, basically 80s for a long, long time to 40s. Anyway, the people are in other people are saying, oh, that's nothing.
Yeah, really.
It's the 40s right now in Seattle.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we've reached a point where we've reached the practical Roman, Greco-Roman age, which were just primitive us. But Kenneth Smith is suggesting that we look back across the gulf of time and look at the early beginnings of this culture. We look back to the Bronze Age, we look back to the Egyptians.
Yeah.
And we have to discover in that something in ourselves which is astounded by some of the beliefs they had and thinking, what were these guys on?
Yes.
Were they taking special substances, or somehow did ancient Egyptians have some sort of knowledge or some sort of understanding which has been lost to us?
So is that why they built those landing pads for alien spaceships, the pyramid-shaped ones?
Which paragraph are we doing? Is it the one that said, yet the age of myths? Is that the one, Rick?
So we're at the last couple of sentences of the paragraph before that. We're making the transition across the two paragraphs right now. So
Across two paragraphs. And you've been on that first paragraph for how long, Rick?
yeah, well, we got through that.
Oh, you did?
We got through a whole nother paragraph. So today we're picking up with the last sentences of the paragraph we had last time so that we can move into the new paragraph.
Oh.
Sharon's right about the one.
So the sentence begins, viewed from the intellectualizing standpoint. Is that the sentence?
Actually, starting with myths are not arguments and do not say explicitly or literally what they are about. And then the sentence that you just said. So they're not arguments. They don't say explicitly or literally what they're about, but they only allude to it in a murky way. The problem is, if you view them from an intellectualizing standpoint, then you see this emptiness and vagueness where you insist the meaning must reside. The meaning must reside in facts and linear logical arguments. And since the myth doesn't have that, you conclude that the myth is empty of value. This is the intellectualizing our intellectualizing standpoint, in the modern age. And also,
so there's an understanding there that's subtle.
Yes.
And the modern age doesn't appreciate the subtle. These mysteries are subtle. We have stuff like the temple sleep, which are a complete mystery to the modern mind, or cases where they literally put a person into a death-like state to meet the gods.
Yes.
And we're thinking, what were these people smoking? They're crazy.
Right.
But there's a suggestion there. Maybe they understood something that we've lost.
Right. Yeah, this entire session day hinges on this question of what myths are versus how the intellectualizing mind thinks they are, and the difference between the two. This is where the point of this paragraph that as Sharon pointed out begins. Yet the age of myths. He's put the paragraph break in an odd place, because really the last two sentences of the previous paragraph are what yet is responding to. Saying so myths are not trying to be logical arguments, but Noesis insists on evaluating them only as logical arguments, and thus it finds them wanting. And so this paragraph is starting by saying, yet there's a problem here, which is that myths were not about trying to be lists of facts and logical arguments. They were trying to do something else that we also need. And as long as we evaluate them, from the Noetic perspective, we're missing out on what that is. This paragraph, with the previous work established that we've spent all these months working on, this paragraph, yet the age of myths begins, actually gives us a definition of myths.
And but daily we have it with the dream. We have a dream life, which certainly doesn't fit in with a Noetic way of thinking.
Right. And that's what we're going to explore here in a moment. But first we have hands. So Phil and then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I actually thought about this, and it came up during a meetup with Plato and the Republic. We were going over the same thing, and of course, in setting up the Republic, Plato apparently is trying to set up a kind of more rational or based thing, and he wants to set up a state that was going to obliterate all the chaos and all that kind of stuff, and the myth, the really essentially lies with maybe a few positive points that are points, but mostly lies. And I really want to defend myth. I said, well, that's not true. Like even back at that period, of course, they didn't have what we would call modern psychology, but they did have psyche. And psyche seems to be embodying some kind of inner anxiety about what's happened. And then the reply was, well, but the Trojan War never really happened. This is all made up. And I said, yes, it did. I said, it was a memory of the Bronze Age collapse. That was between 1200 BC and 1100 BC, roughly the height of it maybe 1175 BC. Of course, at that time when Plato was writing, the specific of that was probably forgotten, but I think I said people had the memory that's passed down about something terrible that happened. And in fact, Troy itself was destroyed. So Troy did happen. He said, well, they didn't know that. You said, yeah, but I said, we now understand that we can authenticate that. So you have to think in terms of that was happening in the past to Plato's time. And they lost a memory of it, except for the fact that there's some anxiety that was left over about that whole period, which is embodied in the myth. And now we authenticate it in the future. So you have to think of time as the past, the present in relation to the future. It's a much more complex relationship of time than just say, what's happening now? I mean, so therefore, this whole thing is really the relationship of the future, past, present, and all that. And it's like that's embodied in myth itself. So this whole issue wasn't settled, but I argue for it that was a deep memory and a deep understanding of some very, very tremendous tragic period that happened. Actually, probably in some ways more tragic than the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. So in some sense, this really was embedded in the psyche of human beings at that time. So that was my argument. The truth of myth.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's a tricky issue. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I hope we get through this today, because I think the preceding two sentences and this whole paragraph summarizes all of section F, Lethos and Logos.
I agree.
This is the focal point of the entire exercise.
Yes.
And so there are a couple of points I want to make. So yes. This weekend, I watched an old series on PBS called The Power of Myth by a guy called Joseph Campbell. And it's a series that was done by my favorite person, Bill Moyer. Right? And he makes a couple of points. And I think myth is an all-encompassing, continuing, and I want to say adventure. It's the way we as human beings and the way as societies establish themselves. And it's multifaceted. Myth, you find myth, there are factors that are in religion, all the sacred stories and all the parables for all the religions, the Abrahamic religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, they're all supported by a lot of myth. And from that come the rituals by which we live. That's all very mythical. But the rituals and the religions, it kind of leads us into the logos, which is where this chapter, which is where this paragraph takes us. And there's a constant interplay, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Rick. This is just for my reading. There's a constant interplay between what is a myth and what is logos. And it has to do with the way the society evolves. And it's interesting that you brought up about Plato, Phil, because Joseph Campbell talked about that Plato, when he was in his early writings, he alluded to myths. I didn't understand it because, I'm not very sophisticated. But myth is the way we have lived in the ancient times, in the medieval times, and we continue to live through myths in the modern times. The interpretation may be a little bit different, but it's still an operative entity by which we live. We set up our societies and our lives.
May I just quickly react to what Sharon just said?
Huh?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, it just, based on what you just said, Sharon, I'm thinking, even concept of Jesus and Christ, but people from outer space may think, oh yeah, those are mythological figures for those human beings,
The virgin birth is a myth.
Yeah.
Is it not?
It's myth. Yeah.
It is.
I agree with you, Sharon.
Yeah, Sharon, I think you're right on. This is the issue he was alluding to with there's a sentence he wrote in the paragraph before, which I'm going to put in the chat now. Among the Greeks, philosophy indeed did not become an arid figment of the intellect, but retained the voice of a distinctive individual. This is talking about what you're talking about. Even when they built logic and tried to be as logical as possible and laid out the rules of logic, the way that they proceeded with logic was infused with the character of their mythology. And it's one of the points that Kenneth Smith and other existentialists make frequently, that hyper-intellectuals and hyper-noetic people often seem to be struggling they seem to be striving on a quest to create pure intellect. And what they're failing to understand is there can't be any intellect at all without this giant unconscious, domain of myths and dreams and cultural formatting that makes it possible to think intellectually in the first place. It's like under the house, which might be completely clean inside, is all the dirt. And if it weren't for the dirt, where'd you put your house? I mean, and the house is built out of things that grew in the dirt. Everything about the logically planned house absolutely depends on the soil. But it's possible for people who spend too much time in the house to forget that there's a relationship between the dirt and the cleanliness, and that you can't have the cleanliness without the dirt. And this is the point that he and others make about logic and intellect, that the logos utterly depends upon the pre-rational, pre-conscious parts of the culture to get it started and to give it its building blocks that it then tries to work on logically. So what you're talking about is right on here, that there is a very close relationship between the two. I mean, it's intimate. And he says for him as a philosophy professor, he got far enough into it, looking at these relationships, that when his students would raise their hands, in the very first class and start asking questions, he could tell almost immediately what kind of ideologies and cultures they were bringing with them. Almost every word of the sentence that they would say sort of implied this larger picture of a life, some of which they were aware of contributing to their ideas, and others of which they weren't aware of, but were still contributing. So
can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
Because I listen a lot, and I listen to Stephen a lot, because he's a pretty well-informed young man. And he's always talking about the rationalists. Well, no, to rationalize is the way you come by knowledge according to reason and logic. Correct?
That's what
you said logic, and that just triggered something in my mind. When you don't use reason to come by knowledge, it's faith, experience, tradition. Not so much experience, but faith and tradition. And all those evolved from myths. faith and tradition. Those are mythically evolutionary issues. And I hope I'm getting this right.
Certainly they're closely related. They're closely related. And experience is a huge part of this. You know, it's the experience of life, sensing the things that you sense, feeling the things that you feel, remembering the things that you remember. This is all coming from gnosis, right? This is that other faculty of the brain that reason doesn't really want to acknowledge. And all of this stuff is what plugs you into the real world, right? The real world impacts you through your ability to see it and feel it and taste it and smell it and so forth. And all of these sensations as a result give your brain leashes so that your brain is leashed to reality. You can only get as long as you deal with what am I seeing right now? What am I smelling right now? You can only get so far away from what's actually true. You know, you may not be interpreting it correctly, but you're at least tethered to it. You know, if you the first time I ever had a persimmon, I'd read about persimmons and how big they are in Japan and how popular they are. And I'm like, well, I want to eat this amazing fruit.
Yeah,
so I went and I bought a persimmon.
Yeah.
And I took a bite. And what I didn't understand and nobody had prepared me for is that you only want to take a bite of a persimmon after it's ripe.
Yes.
Because when it's not ripe, your entire mouth desiccates like chalk. It's a feeling no fruit I'd ever had, no food I'd ever eaten could possibly
Rick, it's two different types of persimmons. The ones that are pointed, those are the ones that you have to be very careful, and it's absolutely have to be ripe. But the flat, round ones are not like that. Yeah, I just had one yesterday, in fact. So that's amazing. As a child, my aunt in Korea had a persimmon orchard at our house. So I grew up eating persimmons since I was 3 years old or whatever. So
yes,
first time you had persimmon, huh, Rick?
Well, it was a decade or two ago, but I will never forget that experience. It's the first time in my life my mouth just dried out. I was like, "What is happening? What's wrong?" And the thing is, what's important about that experience is I didn't have the knowledge or intellectual framework to interpret what was happening. But that absolutely did not prevent me from being in immediate and powerful contact with reality. Something very real was happening in my mouth. And my brain had to play catch up to try to come up with some ideas about what to do about it.
Can I just add one more thing, Rick? I just noticed that Stephen's face when 10 years younger, when Sharon said that young man, Stephen, just wanted to make
You see the boy now, don't you? Right? We're all little kids, in adult bodies. So that's what I'm trying to respond to you, Sharon, is say that, there's this way in which the raw experience itself and our memories of it and our feelings about it, that's the place that all of our other mental things come from. So, even myths are derived from the raw experience, just like theories and ideas and logic are derived from the raw experience. It's why when we're first born, we're not even verbal. I mean, we couldn't craft a myth to save our lives or conduct a logical syllogism, but we do feel very strongly. So, we start out really plugged into life, and it's the gnosis that lets us do that. Go ahead.
So I have one last comment. So therefore, to be rational, is that on the way? Is that part of the evolution of logos?
Yeah.
That's the question I had.
Yeah, the word rational plays a critical role in the paragraph that follows today's focus. And we might get to it today. We'll see. But you're right that this paragraph is the heartbeat of section F. This is where it all comes together. And by focusing on the myth so much in this paragraph, he sets us up to be able to come back to reason in the paragraph that follows. Rational, he contrasts being cunning with being rational. And he contrasts, let's see, what's the other part of the pair? Here it is. Sorry, calculating and rational is the first comparison. And then manipulative and masterful is the second comparison. I'll just go ahead and drop it in now. This is the paragraph that we'll be doing next week, but it directly applies to what you're saying. Among the Greeks, philosophy and where it is? That's not the paragraph I meant. Give me a second. Here it is. Copy, paste. That's better. Logos culture, you were asking about reason, right? And the logos. Logos culture has a greatly reduced regimen. Oh no, that's not it. Oh yes, that is it. That is it. Has a greatly reduced regimen of authority. A greatly reduced regimen of authority. Myth is all about authority. What are the things in the cosmos that have authority over us? And how do we make them memorable so we can't possibly forget about them? But in reason, we deal more with rules and chains of reasoning and chains of evidence. So a greatly reduced regimen of authority as the core principle of a form of social order in which human beings become, and here's the two pairs, more calculating and yet far less rational. And here he's using the word rational in an odd way. More manipulative and yet far less masterful over their own selves. I wouldn't have used the word rational there. Kenneth goes back and forth about the word rational. Sometimes he uses it as a synonym for the intellect and logic and noesis and Verstand. Sometimes he uses it to mean Vernunft and the heuristic integrated mythic mind. And here he's using it in the more mythic sense, which actually I think degrades the comprehensibility of the sentence. I think the word he was looking for is intelligent. More calculating and yet far less intelligent. And I say that because Kenneth likes to make a distinction between intelligence and intellect. He says intellect, derived from the past participle of the Latin to think, is about not thinking now, but merely reciting and replaying things you've thought in the past. And he says the act of logic is largely an act of playing by the rules you previously memorized. And so that's what gives it its mechanical, non-living quality and makes it able to be, on the one hand, brilliant. You can make these amazing creations, but on the other hand, very stupid because you're not paying attention to the world around you. You're locked into the formal schema of thinking. So he contrasts that with intelligence, which is the present participle of the Latin verb to think. So it's like thinking and thought are what correspond to intelligence and intellect. So I think he probably would have preferred to use the word intelligent here instead of rational, because for Kenneth Smith, intelligence includes both faculties of the mind harnessed into Vernunft, into that mythic format. Whereas rational sometimes strictly means the intellect, the noesis. So we got a word problem here, and he's sort of contributed to it. And the reason he contributes to it is because, English is a problem this way. All our words for thinking and thought have these blurry meanings. And it's very hard to communicate with the crispness that Hegel does, or Heraclitus, or Aristotle. The Greek and the German have more, they can make these distinctions more cleanly than we can. And it's all too easy, even for somebody like Kenneth, to slip up and use the word rational in a place where that's actually ambiguous, which way he means it. So, I
got one last thing.
Yeah.
Because you put that sentence up, the first sentence of the preceding paragraph is such a contrast. It says, yet the age of myths fed the moral, religious, and political sanity of the whole person. And the new logos culture appealed to the intellect only.
Yes.
I think those two either contrast or complement each other. I'm not sure.
They do. They go very well together. And I think he planned that. And for that reason, instead of rational in that other sentence, I might have put sane. More cunning and yet far less sane. Right? That's the modern world in a nutshell, right? The whole myth of Atlantis, they were able to do amazing, they were incredibly educated, they did amazing technological works, but they created their own destruction through foolishness. This is like, I'm not the first person, I'm not even the 1000th person to say, that sounds a lot like the modern world. We made nuclear bombs. What the hell were we thinking? There's this way in which, we have that problem of the what's the word? Enfant terrible, where, we have these amazing capabilities and yet we're just lagging way behind on our moral judgments about which of the things we can do, should we do. And that's what he's getting at when he's talking about calculating versus sane or intelligent or healthy, wholesome. It's like there's a lot of words you could put after that, yet far less introduction to that clause. So basically reason grows out of this bolus of experience, right? The gnosis is the bedrock for every other faculty of the mind. And then noesis becomes this fruit. Or if you want to think of it differently, it becomes a tree that grows out of the soil of gnosis. But either way, it's dependent upon it. The gnosis is much larger. Our experiences, our feelings, our memories, that experiential life is much larger than the intellectual part of our life. And it wouldn't even be possible without it. So that's the relationship. So the way that he's using myths in section F, myths aren't a primitive form of logos. They're a more advanced form of thought. Myths are the form of thought where you realize I need to somehow connect people's intellectual life to their experiential life so that I don't reason in advance of the evidence, in ways that lead me into kind of crazy talk. And also so that I don't stay parochial, trapped within my own experience. I need something that can draw me upward and outward to pay attention to the big things that matter and to see how to use my two faculties together to succeed. And that's what myth is for, is to it's the responsibility of Aristoi under the ancient Greek schema. And put another way, it's the responsibility of adults. It's why adults exist in Homo sapiens, is to put together experience and theory in a way that can help us be sane as a species. Because we can't do it for free the way a cat or a tree can. Cats and trees are sane for free, but we're not. We need somebody to play this function to help us become sane. Donald and then Phil. Come off mute, Donald, and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I appreciate that the Greeks may have had some post-traumatic stress syndrome due to the Bronze Age collapse. But I think part of why that might have been traumatic is, the Greeks back then, just like now, they had boats. There's lots of evidence they went all over the Mediterranean. They went into the Black Sea. One of the places they went was Egypt. And so even at the time of the Bronze Age collapse, Egypt has had about 2,000 years of continuous civilization at that point. So they know that there's an alternative. That there are stable civilizations that don't collapse. And the other, I think maybe for Phil, since the Greeks went all around in the Black Sea, they may have gone to Troy. There's probably some little kid there with a donkey saying, for 3 drachma, I'll take you to the ruins of Troy, and you can see it. It was a tourist feature or something. Whether it was Troy, I wouldn't know, but who knows? But they could have described the area around Troy. They could have been there. The places, the cities mentioned they could have visited them. They're known to them. But I think Egypt also was what made the rise and fall of civilizations seem. If it's the only thing you've experienced, then you would just say that's normal. But if you knew one nearby that didn't undergo those cycles, you might say, wait a minute, it's not normal. Maybe there are other archae at work here.
Yeah. That's such an important point. I don't know if we've talked about it in all the time we've been doing these seminars, but Egypt didn't fall. During the Bronze Age collapse, Egypt didn't fall. They were able to repel what they called the Sea Peoples. They said, and if it weren't for Egypt, we wouldn't know hardly anything. As it is, we know hardly anything about who caused the Bronze Age collapse. But the little that we do know comes from the Egyptians. Now, archaeology gives us, all over the Mediterranean, gives us evidence of the fires and the collapse of city-states, but it doesn't tell us why. But it's the Egyptians who say that they, during such and such years of the such and such dynasty, they repelled invasions by the sea peoples, who were these aggressive attackers, and that they had been trashing city-states all over the Mediterranean, but Egypt was too big for them. Egypt was too strong for them. And so Egypt repelled them and documented that it had happened. And most of the theories about the Bronze Age collapse, have to use that as a starting point to say, well, this is telling us something. If climate could have contributed, right? That's one of the theories, that it was a climate change, but it can't have been the only cause, because the Egyptians are recording these actual aggressors moving around, trashing the place. So I think you're right, Donald. It's easy for us, if we don't have that context, to fail to understand that the Greeks weren't just looking back on their own collapse. They were also looking at Egypt and saying, but you didn't collapse. What's going on here? There is this way in which their milieu caused them to ask questions in a more interesting way than moderns often do. We sort of spread this world economy and this way of life everywhere, and what it does is eliminate options and eliminate stimulus for the brain, and it makes us think that this is normal. But the Greeks were standing in a position where they could see alternatives right in front of them, and they had to think more intelligently to try to reconcile, how can both of these things be possible? Another classic example, which I'll just touch on briefly, they talk a lot about the Cyclops, the giants with one eye, and they talk about the age of the giants. In the past, there were these giants who walked on the earth and all that. Well, there's a fascinating article, you can Google for it, that talks about paleontology among the Greeks. Paleontology among the Greeks. Because during the Greek archaic and classical eras, there were dinosaur and mammoth bones and the like just everywhere. I mean, you would just find them sticking out of cliffs or in riverbeds, or they'd come up, you'd plow them up when you're plowing your fields. And they wrote about it. This is one of the weird things that it's the Greek mythology books that we read to try to get an introduction to the Greeks and what their lives are like. Don't talk about the facts that Greek farmers were constantly having their plow turn up a brontosaurus leg. And they're like, what the hell? And so they had to come up with explanations for what are all these enormous creatures that existed before. And as the author of this paper points out, it's very common for mammoth tusks to fall out of mammoth skulls. And what you're left with afterwards, if you turn it and look at it, looks like almost a human upper skull, but with one eye opening. That's where the trunk comes out on the mammoth. That's the nasal passage, but it looks like an orbital cavity. And so, to someone who didn't know that this was a mammoth, you'd look at it and say, well, I guess there was a race of one-eyed giants that was around. Now we, as moderns, we try to divorce their stories about Cyclops from the context and say, look at these crazy people making up lies to satisfy themselves for no good reason at all. But when you put it with the evidence that they're trying to deal with, you can see that they're doing their best to come up with science. I mean, they're basically scientifically evaluating the evidence that's all over the place around them and trying to explain the world. As she says in this article, there was this wave, this fad passed across the Greek lands where they would find these giant skeletons, and if they thought that they might be human, then they thought that they must be one of the heroes of old. And they would exhume the skeleton and take it to their home city and bury it with all rights and honors and put a temple up over it and say, here lies Theseus, a giant of the past age who had this heroic life, and this is his skeleton. And this happened all over the Greek islands. This was happening, and we know because they said so. Herodotus writes about it, others write about it, and it's what we're seeing is a people living in circumstances where they are being stimulated in ways that force them to ask very interesting questions, and they've got that advantage over us. Aside from any other feature of their culture, the fact that you could be standing there and looking at your own dark age on the one hand and Egypt surviving it on the other, it's going to make you think about politics, like Donald said, in a completely different way.
Once when I was visiting Kenneth, I don't know if he sold me or gave me. He gave me a book, and it's all on this Greek paleontology.
Ah, wonderful.
And the finding of these things. It's it's like, and this plate on this dinosaur is shaped the same as the human scapula, only it's the guy would be 20 feet tall, if his bones were that size, and so they did have these things, and I'll have to go find that book. I read it. It's almost unbelievable. I mean,
I'd love to know the title. I want to get a copy.
Yeah. I'm sure it sold in the tens.
Right. These days, they're doing their audience,
brings together all the references in classical literature to findings of dinosaur bones and stuff.
Right.
So.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, things have become complicated because I was going to talk about the intellectual history of mathematics in Western civilization. Maybe I'll put that off, or maybe I'll say it at the tail end. Since we got into the Bronze Age collapse, I sort of have some knowledge of that. I mean, back in those days, before the collapse, there was a lot of trading that was happening in the Mediterranean, particularly in Levant and the whole area. And what happened was the latest theory, and it's actually pretty much authenticated, that it was the result of a climate change. What happened was much of actually even part of Europe dried up and people began to move. And there was also simultaneously, I mean, not at the same time, but within that period, quite a lot of earthquakes that happened. So there's some earth-shattering relationships. And the result was that many places was collapsing on its own and people were moving in. So it was really a migration of people like what they're doing now, like people who are desperate, they move around. And as a result, these sea people apparently were a large group of people, and they're not any particular tribe. By the way, among them were they suspect was the Mycenaeans as a result of that too. And so the reason why Egypt survived is not because they had the power. They did have the power, but the reason Egypt survived was because it didn't collapse there because they had the Nile. The Nile provided assurance of food, in some sense, so it sustained itself. So, and people wanted to go to Egypt because, that's the only place that actually is sustaining. But because they survived as a civilization, and apparently Egypt, as rich as it wasn't as involved in the trading as many of the other civilizations. So therefore, in a sense, the collapse of the trading routes and the trading that sustained the thing, talk about globalization that we have now, talk about climate change. I mean, there's a lot of things that's scary that's like that. So in some sense, Egypt survived partly out of the skin of their teeth because it was very dangerous. Many tribes tried to penetrate Egypt, and they resisted them in the Delta. And of course, because it was also desert all around, it was hard to invade except through the sea. So therefore, they were sustained. And of course, as long as they have the Nile, and it's every year up and down, and it's like the crops are growing. So that was part of it. And I think the Mycenaeans were also part of the thing that, where the climate dried up because, in Greece, it's quite a dry climate. It's very rocky. And I'm sure that they moved into, into Anatolia. which is where Troy is, and probably on down to Levant. And so a lot of that stuff happened, and it started out without civilization itself. I think I will say something about the history of mathematics and intellectual history. And it really began at the time of roughly the time of Plato, because and I'm thinking, like, I guess the first way I want to say that is mathematical realism itself also a myth? Because I'm thinking it's you could really trace it back, well, to the Babylonians, but certainly to the Egyptian, because the myth of Seth is really about the myth of civilization based on measurements and construction and all that. And that was articulated in relationship to Osiris, who's the embodiment of life, and the surplus of living things and civilization. And I wonder in that structure whether civilization, in the sense of developing the cities and all that, did not need calculation itself to, in a sense, produce civilization. I mean, because you have to build things, you have to do this, you have to divide up land, all of that was a function of measurements. And so mathematics is the history of a kind of like, how should you say, a kind of abstract projection of instrumental thinking. But instrumental thinking might have been necessary for the development of civilization. I mean, because people have to gather together. When you have a tribe, you go roam around and everything is okay, if it doesn't get too big. But when you begin to be settled down and become an agrarian culture, you have to stay in a place, you have to divide the land, you have to divide labor, you have to do all sorts of things that have to do with measurements and how you calculate that sort of stuff. Even in trade, you have to deal with mathematics and how you're going to account for how much you owe somebody and so forth. All that stuff may be a phase that was necessary, and maybe a phase that continue to be necessary for development of cities and development of relationship between trade and everything else. So that just might be a tragic myth, that Osiris and Seth was talking about, actually the development of a civilization and how you build that. And the thing about Pythagoras was that Pythagoras, I think the Greeks in general came up with the idea that, not only do you use measurements, but you could begin to theorize it as something that could prove the structure of the internal structure of mathematics itself, which means that it's a step higher than just pure numbers. It's about a theory of numbers themselves. In some sense, that gives you a kind of handle, in a sense, of challenging nature in itself, because you have a proof. It's not just a tool, it's now a proof. So I think that becomes a situation where we begin to have the myth of the realism of mathematics. The mathematic is really the structure of the cosmos itself, not things happen, trees grow, all that. That's fine, but now we have a kind of proof of a deep structure that, in a sense, that we could grab handle on, which is different than a tool. It's a proof that the tool actually has its own functionality. And I wonder whether we have grabbed under the handle and produced all this cosmic computational, because mathematics is a kind of proof that goes beyond cosmology and the Big Bang and all that. And it's sort of like, and even in terms of quantum mechanics, I think that has to do with probability waves and all that kind of stuff, which is once again a structure of mathematics. So I think how far we want to ride that handle begins on, in some sense, how much we need mathematics to be the structure that differentiates us from nature itself. So I think we can't let that part go. We have to somehow find a way to relate that part. In other words, have Seth and Osiris not fight the war and get together. You know what I mean? I think the fact that they parted their ways, I think is what created the problem. I think Seth and Osiris were brothers. They should have had a brotherly relationship rather than, I guess in the old days, when you have a brother who's ruling, you want to kill him so that you could be the emperor. So that to me it's already telling the story of this division of the structure of how should you say, a kind of organic way of looking at things and a kind of structural way of looking at things. But I think that was necessary because, you could go around picking on grain or you could grow it in a more efficient way. And that's, you could, do we want to live in a Paleoanthic existence, or do we want to live in a Neolithic civilization? I mean, it's like it almost seems inevitable it had to become Neolithic. So I'm not sure whether I'm defending that or saying that there's the truth in both sides.
Thank you, Phil. Ginny and then Stephen. Come off mute, Ginny, and tell us what's on your mind.
Human race. What is it about human race? I mean, technologically, they seem to just progress like monumentally, exponentially, whatever. I mean, we have cell phones, we have internet, blah, 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 go on and on and on. And yet we still have people like Putin and Kim Jong-un out there are flourishing. What is it about human race that we can technologically make advancements in leaps and bounds, and yet intellectually, morally, spiritually, we don't seem to be able to evolve and make those leaps and bounds, and that's why we still have wars out there. Yeah, I wonder about human race and why we can't be without people who are causing so much pain to the rest of the human race out there.
And this is why we have philosophy.
I know, but there are not enough people out there doing philosophy and can change the way we behave and exist in this planet and make it easier for, I mean, the fact that we have all these technology to guide, help us to, I mean, there should not be any people who are starving out there, when you really think about it. We should be way beyond that. That's my 2 cents.
Isn't that the human predicament?
This is a uniquely human predicament, right? I mean, we don't see trees having these problems. Yeah, I had raccoons in my backyard the other day. The kittens got to meet raccoons for the first time, looking at them through the glass door, and they were amazed. The raccoons were amazed by the kittens were amazed by the raccoons. But then they turned away and went about their lives. And, the raccoons are most of the time sane from a raccoon perspective, and most of their behavior is sustainable for raccoons. It's good and healthy for raccoons. And our species has this unique problem that we don't have enough instincts to point us in the right direction. It's so easy for us to get off in the wrong direction. And this is what the Greeks are obsessed with. And this is why they think the development of mythology is the primary function of the adult mind. We need to create that replacement for our missing instincts that will help to orient our application of power into healthy directions instead of using it to tear at each other and, destroy ourselves.
Well, human beings want more. There are people who want more. I mean, most of us want more, but there are people who go to extraordinary measure to want more, which if you want more uh, than what you need to take it away from somebody else. That's all there is to it. And there's a lot of like taking away from somebody else. And so therefore, there's always that surplus desire that we all have.
Yeah, greedy,
The trouble.
egotistical, greedy, you know.
Well, I'll
aggressive.
call a surplus desire as greed. You're right. But
Yeah,
it comes from the desire, you know. Having one ice cream cone's enough. You take it from your brother. You know, like, let me have that because you're bigger than he is. And so there you go.
I mean, you know, if you have a food and shelter, that's good enough. Why do you need to live in a mansion, for example? Why do you need a 50-room house? Or, you know,
Go tell the billionaire. Don't tell me.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, this is all a subset of the general problem, which is that our desires are not innate to us, right? My cat's desires are strongly tied to her array of instincts. She can only get so far away from that tether, and that tether keeps her directionality, her intention, her willfulness mostly oriented in healthy directions. But you know, with a whole bunch of that array missing in Homo sapiens, we can want almost everything we want is unnatural. Even when we want the right thing, that has to be cultivated in us unnaturally. We have to be acculturated to want the things that are good for us, and we can just as equally be acculturated to want things that are unhealthy for us. You know, I think about this a lot. Like the imagine a rationalist definition of food that said if you put it in your mouth and swallow it, then it's food, and that's the definition. This is actually no worse than most rationalist definitions of food. It's highly abstract. There are ways to measure it. Did it go in your mouth? Did you swallow it? And it, you know, it satisfies the schema that is the lust of modern definition making. But of course, the problem is it doesn't distinguish between poison and food, right? So yeah, you know, I just put the strychnine in my mouth and swallowed it. Well, according to this definition, it's food. And if that were the way that society were organized, they might have police officers who are out there to make sure that, you know, you don't try to stop people from drinking strychnine because, you know, people are allowed to eat any food they want and it went in their mouth, so it's food. Now, it sounds crazy. It sounds like something Kafka would write, but Kafka was on to the modern world. And what he's illustrating is the way that we don't make the fundamental distinctions between what's healthy and what's not healthy. That's so easy for the animals and plants and fungi around us to make, that they don't wrestle with those questions very much. I mean, when they're little and they're experimenting and they're trying to figure it out, sure, but it doesn't take them that long to figure out, hey, maybe parsley is not good for me because I'm a cat. So I stop trying to eat parsley and I move on to other things that are more interesting, like that little birdie over there. But for human beings, somehow we're missing this part. And if the culture doesn't tell us to stop doing things that make us sick, then, you know, we might just well develop a crazy desire, an obsession with that thing that makes us sick, and then have to latch onto it and make ourselves as sick as possible. So just like there's some people who can be acculturated by their, you know, by their character or their circumstances to want more than they need, I would draw your attention back to the hermits of the early Christian era, who would go, you know, like Simon Stylites, go up on a pole, you know, and I want to have as little as possible. What's the bare minimum that I could possibly have? You know, less than everybody around me. I want as little as possible. There were shut-in hermits at many monasteries where they had a little room that was almost entirely sealed, except there was a back entrance that they could send their, you know, bucket of their bodily waste out each day, and someone could send food in, and they just sit there in their cell, and peasants and people in the town could walk by. They had an opening, a window out on the street, could walk by and ask them questions. I want to talk to a wise man. Well, here's this wise man shut up in this little room, and that's his whole life. He has less than you do, and maybe this will make him wise. You know, this idea in its way is every bit as crazy as the idea that if I have everything, I'll be successful. I mean, and what they have in common is that they're both strictly rational. They have nothing to do with what's actually healthy, right? What is the amount that I need? What is the amount that Phil needs? What's the amount Stephen needs? You know, we're all different people. We all have different needs. You know, my wife, she wants to have a glass of wine at dinner a couple times a month. It's no big deal. it might be healthy. Maybe she should. I have a friend who had heart attacks and he got prescribed a glass of wine a night, to help to manage his stress after he had a stent operation. And it's worked great. He doesn't come from an alcoholic family. He can have a glass of wine a night. But for me, that would be a disaster. We have different needs, right? And what we want is for our desires. I mean, from a healthy perspective, we would like our desires to be aligned with our needs so that we want the things that we need. Fata Morgana, my fate, a fate that is welcome. This is like the animals and the plants and the fungi do. But instead, what we have is a weird disconnect between what we need and what we desire. And this is the entire basis of storytelling, right? The willful character who wants things, but he wants the wrong things. And he has to go through a process of discovery to learn what it is that he actually needs instead of what he wants.
Yeah, but so other species out there, do they have drug addictions like opioids that we're dealing with right now, for example? Can you think of other species out there who have addictions the way human beings have? I wonder.
You can occasionally find examples, but they're conspicuous by being infrequent, right? And it makes sense that they'd be infrequent, because if a species was largely self-destructive over the course of billions of years, it'd be gone. That's how evolution works, right? So, except in our case. So I'm gonna go to the Q&A, and then I'm gonna take us to the text. So Stephen, and then Geneva, and then the text. Come off mute, Stephen, and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I just wanted to refer back to the mythological minds, and I'm going to make the point that, and this might sound a bit mythological, but you've probably heard it before, that we develop through a series of stages, and people will often talk about the 7-year period of stages. We go from 0 to 7 at a certain point of childhood, and then we go from 7 to 14. Now, when we're going from 7 to 14, we're developing intellect. A kid about 7 or 8 is fairly limited on intellect. By the time you're 14, 15 or 16, you can be in uni, you can run around organising intellectual nonsense like protests and all the other nonsense. But if you want to understand myth, you might need to go back a little bit before that intellectual development in your childhood and think back to your experiences that you're having, maybe 7, 8, 6, 5, 4 years old, if you can remember them. And you'll remember experiences where you were impressed by things beyond the intellect. When we get the intellect, we start becoming dry and prosaic and saying, yeah, that's just a rock. That's, yeah. You have experiences in the feeling life before the development of intellect, which are a little bit similar to the dreams. You're thoroughly awake, but your feeling life is so present that you're experiencing things more intensely. I remember my mother taking me to a cafeteria in the city back in the days when they still had the old style cafeterias. And it was an intense experience. And I'd look out the window, and this was a time when they had this vast walkway between these two major city buildings. And it was huge, big X across it, and periodically people would just walk across this walkway as lights, a whole mass of people, broad, not just a narrow walkway. And these were all very impressive, and this is what I'm talking about. In a strange way, when you're in that stage of life, you're actually absorbing realities that the intellectual mind tends to dismiss later. And this is the warning about the intellectual mind, that the intellectual mind, yes, it creates a lot of avenues for us, but it also dismisses reality. That's just reality. Don't bother with that. Yeah, I've seen that one before. What's a new one? Tell me something new I can put in my repository. Yeah, that's great. I'll just ignore reality. I've conquered reality. I'm using the intellect to conquer the real. But yeah, please, just, if you really want to understand mythology, just that little bit, think back to that stage when you're the world was a new experience, a new intense experience. In a strange way, you were feeling reality in a sense that you've lost later. Please don't ignore it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that's gnosis, right? That's that faculty for being plugged into reality. And like any other thing, it's easier for this to make sense when we think about it physically, but it works just as well mentally. For any faculty we have, if you don't use it, it atrophies. You need to exercise and practice these faculties to help. They grow then, right? They expand and become more potent. And so, we always, however much we may love the intellectual life as intellectuals, we still need to look for opportunities to immerse ourselves in powerful experiences, to that where our intellect doesn't help us much, where we really need to be paying attention to how we feel and what's happening around us. It's part of why I love to practice Kobudo and karate, traditional Kobudo and karate, because those moves that you do where you are trying to generate momentum using your body, and you have to learn to stand the right way and to shift your hips and then your shoulders and only then move your arms, the way that there's sort of this kind of building wave of motion through your body. It's not something that you can learn from a book. You have to do it. And what's important is that the act of doing it re-strengthens the gnosis, because now you're depending upon that faculty that you were previously neglecting. And it could be anything in your life, whether it's gardening or art or food, or what have you. But it needs to be something. We have to. It's like a God within us, from the polytheistic sense, that we have to respect that part of ourselves, and we have to spend enough time focusing on it, or else something goes very wrong in us. We start to drift too far, untethered from reality, into the endless world of theories and ideas and systems. Geneva, and then the text. Go ahead, Geneva. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I wanted to address a couple of things I've heard. You talked about eating strychnine. And the thing about that is, if somebody hadn't done it and died, we wouldn't know. So, I mean, we have to go through these things in order to learn what to do, what not to do. So I always shudder when I hear about, we should not have any more wars and everybody should be, full of food and have housing. But we would have nothing more to live for. There'd be no need. If everything was perfect, we'd have no need to exercise that gnosis and that noises, and we'd cease to exist. Like you said, it would just atrophy, because if there weren't Putins and Trumps and wars and people dying and opioid explosion, what would we have to live for? I mean, we have to figure out, how do we fix this? What do we do about this? I mean, that to me seems to be the whole point of life. We know, okay, don't eat strychnine, don't drink bleach, but somebody had to do it first and died before we figured it out. It's like, oh shit, don't eat bleach, don't drink bleach, don't eat strychnine. I mean, and even with medications, you look at it on television and see the medications, and then you hear the side effects that go on for about 20 minutes. It's like, do I really want to take this shit? But somebody is trying these things out and they're exercising what we're talking about. But if we don't have that, because everything is perfect and wonderful and beautiful, and everybody's fed and has a house and a car and whatever they need, what the hell else would we do with ourselves? I mean, we've got to figure out, what do we do about Trump? What do we do about Putin? What do we do about war? What do we do about the homeless? And, and so I don't think that those things are ever going to go away, because if they do, we'd have no more reason to be here. And we'd cease to exist. Like you said, it would be our faculties, our mental faculties, intellectual faculties would atrophy, and we'd just cease to exist. So that's kind of how I look at it. It's about evolution. It's not about perfection. It's about progress.
Thank you, Geneva.
But may I break real quick? But yeah, I believe in evolution. Jesus Christ, absolutely. But why are we evolving in such a harmful, counterproductive to human race way? I mean, did Putin, did he have to kill millions of people in the process of being power hungry and wanting to, take over Ukraine and blah, blah, blah? I mean, really? I mean, we're talking about millions of people dying because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. That's a hell of a lot of payment that had to be paid for few people, at the top who wanted this and that and whatever. Anyway.
Thank you, Jenny. And I see Sharon wants to add something too, and then we'll go to the text.
The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
That's the answer to that question, to those questions.
Thank you, Sharon.
What was it, Sharon? I'm sorry, I missed it.
C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Problem of Pain, which is
Okay,
all about a set of questions.
Okay. Thank you.
So, I mean, I think we could take hope from the fact that evolution happened for billions of years before people did anything at all. So there's nothing that we need to do to cause there to be evolution. We don't need to manufacture disasters just so that we'll stimulate our gnosis. And nature has it's one of its characteristics, along with its sort of like abundant, wasteful creativity, is this sort of abundant, wasteful generation of stimuli that engage us and that we can respond to. So we happen to be living on a planet that's very well suited to stimulating us to develop. And this is something that Kenneth Smith alludes to in section F when he talks about the teleology, that there is something within us that drives toward wanting to learn more and develop. If it's not killed within us, if that spirit is not killed within us, we will naturally grow out of ourselves into something else. We'll be seeking to something else to grow into. Now, I think about the way that when we were growing up, children's television often presented people, well, even before I was young, in previous generations, children wanted to grow up without anybody catering to them, trying to create a world of cute television shows starring children and books starring children and comics starring children. They didn't need all of that to want to grow up. They would just look around at the adults around them and say, wow, these people are so large and capable of doing things, and maybe someday I can be large and capable of doing things. Their immediate reaction was to be drawn out of themselves towards development. And also, as this existentialist tradition argues, even if we have consciously given up on the idea of development and becoming better than we are, our bodies are still like any other organism, as they're not just what they are, but they're also the seeds of our future selves, and we're in the process of becoming. So there is always going to be this process of transformation. So the text. Yet the age of myths fed the moral, religious, and political sanity of the whole person. Right. This is in response to the previous paragraph, which ended with that sentence about how the intellect criticizes myths for seeming to be pseudo-knowledge, seeming to be obscure, seeming to be bad theory. And he starts the new paragraph saying, yet the age of myths fed the moral, religious, and political sanity of the whole person. Moral, what should we be doing? religious, where do we fit within the larger scheme of things, and political, how do we relate to one another? How do we be more than just a bunch of individuals clawing at each other? How do we create a culture, a polis? How do we create a direction to be able to do things as a group? And the new logos culture appealed to the intellect only, and its narrow vocabulary of forms and definitions. So he's talking here about this split from mythos culture to logos culture, and how, although from a modern perspective, we think that whatever comes second is more advanced than what came first, that what was happening in classical Greece was that they had been flourishing during their mythos culture era. And by the time they're transitioning into logos culture, they're beginning their decline. And it's hard for us to think that way because all the writers we've heard of, in popular culture, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, we've heard of these people, so we think that must be the pinnacle. But that's not what Thucydides says. In the history of the Peloponnesian War, the argument of the entire book is this is a debacle the likes of which the previous generations wouldn't have made. We are betraying our core principles in a way that we didn't used to do. When we came together to fight the Persians, we were a better people than we are now that we're splitting apart to fight each other. There's something has gone wrong with us. And Aristotle's whole response, actually even Plato's response, right? What is the Republic except his repudiation of Athens for having done in Socrates, right? His beloved Socrates, Athens murdered his beloved Socrates. So he's like, screw you guys. You aren't the model of a republic. This fictional model of a republic I'll write down in a book is better than you. He's had it. He says Athens is past its prime. And when Aristotle's writing, he's criticizing Plato, among other things. And he's also criticizing the Greeks of his era. And he's doing it by saying, by nature, who are we supposed to become? And leaving it to the contemporary Athenian reader to go, wow, that sure doesn't sound like any of the politicians I see today. Shit, where did the good ones go? Right? He's setting up this whole work so that it will create the effect in the reader of realizing that we've passed our prime. And this is why you're going to find Aristotle later advising Alexander the Great on how to rule over the Greeks. Because the Greeks, somebody needs to fix this mess, and the Greeks clearly can't do it. We've passed our prime. So logos culture is a symptom of the decline. The Greeks have backslid from the adult mythic mind into the adolescent or early 20s, intellectualizing mind. And they're meansy and thinking about how do I get what I want, and they're not thinking about what happens if we all pursue that, if we just pursue what we want. Remember, in Athenian culture, in classical Greek culture, they have a division of the economy into the oikos, the household, the agora, the market, and the polis, which is where the political action happens, where we meet and have political debate and discussion. And they associate these things with the douloi, the banausoi, and the aristoi. To live in the life of the oikos, the household, is to live the life of a doulos, obsessed with your experience, your feelings, your memories, and the labor you have to do to feed yourself and clothe yourself, and just it's survival level, it's animal level. Well, the Greeks thought animals actually have it better off than that. Then, if you can rise above that to the level of intellectualizing and learning skills, you can rise to the level of a banausos, and you can work in the agora, where you could be a craftsman, you can build things, right? You can become a master carpenter, or you can become a trader and become good at numbers and calculating how much can I take on a shipment out, and where should I take it to get the best trade deals, and so forth. This is an intellectualizing, schematizing level of life, but it's still not the adult human life. It's still a kind of adolescent life where you don't see the big picture and you're not oriented towards the most important things to survive. It's the mythic mind, the eristic mind, at which you understand those other things, but now you can put it all together and think, what for the long run is the best for our people or our species? Where are we all going? What are the consequences of these actions? And you can think about when you find answers, how do I, or even when you just find problems, how do I encode that in a mythic form so that people with underdeveloped minds, douloi and banausoi, can still learn some of this wisdom through these compelling stories. And that way they can be better versions of themselves, or maybe some of them can develop to the next stage of development. This is the framework that they've constructed. So to the Greeks, the idea that logos culture is an inferior form of culture because it's the culture of the marketplace, where people have to be reminded by the statues of the charities not to prey upon each other like terrible predators, right? Because it's so easy for the Banausos to lose track of why we're doing these things. They aren't thinking about the principles. They aren't thinking about the big picture. They aren't thinking about the consequences. They're just thinking about this quarter's profits. They're thinking about, can I build this building? They're thinking, can I manufacture this atomic bomb? Not, should I be manufacturing this atomic bomb for the Nazis who are paying me to do it? You know, there's the larger picture is elusive within the framework of logos culture. But because we're a logos culture, we're inclined to take issue with Kenneth Smith's argument here. When he says the new logos culture appealed to the intellect only in its narrow vocabulary of forms and definitions. You want to offend an enormous number of intellectuals, you just unleash this sentence, you know, upon the world. He's like, no, it's not narrow. The mind of the life of the mind is everything. Mathematics is everything. Logic is everything. This is the most important stuff. Nothing's as important as this. It can't be a step backwards. It's impossible. The intellectual says, I deny that all those stupid irrational feelings are the important part of life. It has to be my beautiful pure logic and my ability to rise within our system. That has to be the point of life. This is what the Banausos says. So he's directly contradicting that here in this opening sentence. And I'm going to call on people in a moment, but first I'm going to do the second sentence just to enrich this, because he's always, each of these sentences is a transition. So where is he going with this contrast of myths feeding the whole person, both faculties of the mind, whereas the logos culture is only a half-witted approach, you know, appealing to noesis and not to gnosis. So what's he doing here? He says, myth animated an organic culture, right? Not an artificial culture that we sort of designed everything, but an organic culture in which we inherited an enormous amount without designing it ourselves. It just evolved into place through trial and error over thousands of years. Animated an organic culture with heroic or symbolic, for those Jungians among you, heroic or symbolic personalities, right? If you want to get people to understand an important abstract principle, you have to clothe it in a human form, so that people can have a relationship to it, so they can have feelings. We can have feelings about Oedipus that are hard for us to have about the principles at stake in his story. So if those principles if someone attempts to just transmit those principles to us like theories or mathematical proofs, it won't reach most of us. And if it does, we'll forget it soon. But if it comes to us in the shape of this terrible story that happened to this guy, then nobody can forget it. It sticks in the mind. So he's talking about anthropomorphization, right? That the way that we convey these deeper lessons is through anthropomorphization. That's the importance of myth. Presenting individuals who symptomatize moods, appetites, and states of minds. Moods, appetites, and states of minds. This is a map of the different states that any one of us could be in. And by attempting to anthropomorphize those things, what he's trying to do is what he's saying myth is trying to do is create a map of human existence, human experience, right? Who's the angry character? Who's the greedy character? Who's the sad character? Who's the logical character? You know, we start to have these people embodying these figures so that we can see how they relate to each other. And in so doing, we start to understand what it's like to be possessed by these moods and appetites and states of minds. We start to understand that that's not a bunch of people out there. All of that is ourself and the transformations we go through, and therefore the ways that we should learn to question our interpretation of events depending upon which mood or appetite or state of mind has us from moment to moment, right? Don't make decisions when you're angry is an example of a conclusion drawn from this kind of behavior. We see the stories about people who act hastily when they're angry and then they repent later. And then so we can generalize that and take it back to ourselves and say, I noticed that I'm angry right now. Maybe this is not a good time to send this email. Maybe I'll just save this email and come back to it later when I'm calm, right? There's a certain amount of learning from experience that's embodied in mythic structure. So he says, whereas logic nourishes nothing in the will or conscience, but only chastens thinking against formal fallacies. Right? There's rules of logic. If you break the rules, it's wrong. That's what logic teaches us. Follow the rules, don't break them. But it doesn't teach us don't do logic when you're angry, right? It doesn't teach us be careful what you wish for. It doesn't teach us all those things we need to know that are the ways in which we sabotage our own lives through the consequences of our actions if they're ill-examined. Logic's no good at that. That's not its strong suit, which is why adolescents are constantly jumping off roofs and breaking their legs and doing all kinds of other crazy things because they have the power of semi-adult human bodies and developing capacity for logic, like Stephen said, but they don't have the life experience and wisdom. And this is a place where wouldn't it be nice to insert some wisdom right there in the form of myths? It's like, yeah, kid, I know you feel like you can do anything, but let me tell you about another guy who thought he could do anything and how things ended up for him. And then the kid goes, on second thought, maybe I'm not going to try to do that. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, my thought is a little different from yours in this sense. I'm thinking the relationship of what Plato's education is in relationship to how civilization developed. Plato made a big deal about teaching children music because it's the sensual understanding of the rational mind of let's say, a mathematics. So that if you get used to music, you kind of intuitively learn to understand proportions and all that. And then when you get to math, that will become much easier to access. And I wonder whether it's not the other way around. I mean, mathematics is an extraction of something like music. Because one thing about music is that it has internally structure within it harmony, which is the relation of many parts to create the overtones. That's a surplus of just singularities, which is interesting. And I'm thinking back, let's say, how did Paleolithic culture evolve into Neolithic culture? Because in the Paleolithic culture, there's still a kind of hierarchy of sort. You have the chief, the leader, whatever it is. But I think the groups are small enough that the leader, whoever the leader or the medicine man, is always embodying the whole, feeding back to the whole. It's never like, separated to that degree, although there are many leaders in that sense. But when you get to even have towns and then cities, and then let's say a whole culture, then in a sense, the simple way is to divide the responsibilities between the various skills of different people, which I'm sure different people have different skills. So you accentuate a kind of efficiency of how a structural system will work. But as it grows even more, it begins to harden into a structure in which is essentially a caste system, right? You're a soldier, you're an administrator, you're a seller, all that sort of stuff, and subdivide it. And then the harmony that is essentially there in a small tribe begins to break down into hierarchy more and more. And when you have a hierarchy that's about separation, you're a lowly ditch digger, a medium farmer. I guess you could be suppressed enough to like obey the laws, or you begin to develop resentments, and there's a different structure. That guy is really rich. All these synthetic things that might not have been there in a tribal culture or even like in a group of geese begin to be a synthetic structure of resentment and desires and wants. God, if I was just only a king, I could have that big palace. I could have all the jewels I want. All these things that may not have much importance or to the degree of importance as it has now. And and we develop into something, a civilization like this, you begin to say, God, if I could only have $1 million or $1 billion, I could have everything I want. But that may not have anything to do with life itself. I mean, it has something to do with, but we exaggerated that. So we begin to develop a culture that's supposed to be unified, but it's actually a culture of dissection and difference and separation and this linearity. And I wonder whether if we have somehow pay more and more attention to the fact of harmony, whether we wouldn't be teaching music all the way through, whether that they would graduate into mathematics. You see what I'm saying? Like in a sense that, yes, there are all these separate notes, but they harmonize. I really realize this. I'm a great listener of music, and I just ran into this guy who was explaining music, and I wrote to you about it, Steve, but I mean Rick, but I didn't send it to everybody else. And this guy said, one of the greatest melodic things that I've ever heard is Schubert's quintet in C major. He said, before I do that, I want to say the second thing, because Schubert is very melodic. And I listened to the second thing, and yes, indeed, I understand that it was very melodic. And then I listened to this thing about the C major quintet. I didn't understand what he was talking about because it didn't sound melodic to me. And what was interesting is that he grafted it, the sheet music, and they played it, and he will highlight these various parts, how they interact with each other. When he was talking about melody, I would say, oh, I didn't understand that. I mean, like, I always had trouble with chamber music, which I always found is the highest one. It seems to be something you have to almost understand. You almost have to be a practicing musician to understand chamber music because it's so interactive in relationship to each other. And when he showed that, I begin to understand it's the movement of the harmony throughout a melodic linearity. So how do you relate a linear flow, which is melody, in relation to the verticality that produces the surplus, which I never thought of, because I always thought of Chopin, great, wonderful melodies, but the movement of the entire orchestra in relationship that harmonizes with each other was a different way of looking at melody, a very complex melody of multiple parts in interaction with each other. I think if you could, and if I had, other than a listener, if I had like musical education as a foundation, then I might have understood that from the beginning. I might begin to see society as a relationship of all these parts to each other rather than, let me just follow this guy doing this and that guy doing this and this. And I don't see that they are the same, unified, if they were working together, rather than the fact that, oh, that's just 5 different guys doing their thing. They just happen to be in the same space. I mean, I kind of think I think maybe Plato had it wrong in a sense. Learn mathematics first, and then you listen to music and say, now you understand what music really is, what harmony is, what the potential of mathematics could be, is the surplus of the relationship between all the singularities. So that was a very enlightening thing. I mean, I don't think I will ever understand that because it's a little late for me. But the fact that he grafted that out and show how they broke apart and relate to each other in separate parts and joined together again, it's like it was very enlightening. So I always have the image in my mind, even though I will never get it in a sense through my understanding in my sensory apparatus.
Mhm.
I'll have at least a sketch, a very slight sketch of understanding that intellectually. So that's interesting. That's what I want to say. Maybe civilization went for the role of efficiency of individual parts, and that's what the problem we have. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, it's a complicated problem, and I adore music, so I certainly am going to empathize with your approach to looking at music possibly as being a metaphor for, in some ways, human relationships and larger scale human organization. But overall, I don't feel confident I have a good grasp of how to make some of these things work. Like I see a lot of the pieces of the problem, but I don't see how it all pulls together.
I can say that when I took piano lessons, math made much more sense to me than it ever had before.
Yes.
And I could even, back in the day, some of you might remember this, back in the day, I actually was able to balance my checkbook because something about the fingering, the pedals, the reading the music had something to do with mathematics. I have no idea what it was, but it definitely worked.
Yeah.
So I understand what Phil is saying here.
Yeah. Yeah. Plato and the Pythagoreans are right on about that part. There's an enormous amount to be learned about the relationships between math and music. And we mostly don't teach that anymore. We mostly teach them as separate disciplines, each with its own grade and so forth. Stephen,
we can't waste that time because we got to teach them business.
We have to teach them how to pass their tests so that they're not held back, right? No child left behind. You're going to be left behind unless you pass the test. So there's no time for you to learn anything but how to pass the test. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just looking at the succeeding paragraphs now. He's making the point with Plato that he's a move on from somebody like Heraclitus. And he's claiming Plato, he seems to be saying Plato's there thinking, oh, what's wrong with Athens? This is how I can fix it up. But he seems to have been a bit critical of Plato's position there, like Plato's thinking, hey, I've got the answers. I'm Plato. I'm smarter than everybody else. But what's his point there? He just seems to be saying, oh, that maybe Plato's overlooked a few things, or he hasn't quite picked up on what was really going on. He's thinking, oh, you dudes are doing the wrong thing. I've got the answers. Just follow my lead. But what's the problem with that? What's the problem Smith is making out here? I'm curious.
Well, I can hardly step into this area without Donald perking up. And there goes the hand, because Donald and Kenneth have a tug of war about Plato. Donald feels Kenneth is being a little oversimplifying and unfair to Plato, and I suspect Donald's right about that. But I'm gonna sidestep. I'll go ahead and call on Donald in a moment, but I'm gonna sidestep the question a little bit by saying, I think part of underlying all of this, I think part of Kenneth's diss on Plato is not about Plato at all. It's about the fact that the medieval monks chose to throw away so many other manuscripts and just copy Plato. Plato himself was writing in a context where there were a lot of other people philosophizing. He was an Aristos. He was part of a culture of Aristoi, and he was trying to contribute to that culture. He's responding to the people around him, and he meant his conversations. There's a reason why he uses dialogues. He meant his conversations to be taken in context of that larger discussion that was happening in Athens. But by the time the medieval monks are done with him, most of the rest of the conversation has been removed and left behind. And all we have left is Plato's side of the conversation. And I think of it like if Plato had known that none of that other work was going to survive, and only his work was going to survive, and that his audience wasn't just going to be Athenians, but was going to be these alien medieval and modern mentalities, he might have written very differently than the way he actually did. We can all only write to the audience we know, and we all suffer from what happens when somebody else takes our words out of context and says, aha, he said this and he must have meant it in the following ways. It's like, no, you missed the rest of the conversation. So we'll have plenty of time to diss Plato throughout the rest of this book because the medieval, especially Augustine, is gonna be taking Plato as a model and running with him, and Kenneth's gonna have things to say about that when we get to that part. So I'm not gonna put too much into this right now. Also because I know Donald is about to step in and supply some missing context. So go ahead, Donald. Tell us about Plato.
Well, I think you're mostly right there. Yeah, having the good become the God was something that is unforgivable. But Plato, in my view, is part of the evidence that Greek culture had collapsed. He's like in the Republic. It's how would you refound the polis? Well, you'd only need to do that because you'd lost the polis. How can you be a good man without the context of the polis to support those efforts? I mean, it's a sign. I think, Plato is two things. He is one of the last Aristos, and that by being an Aristos doesn't mean you're perfect or unerring or anything. It means you're capable of critical examination. But he's a sign, Athens has collapsed. What in the hell went wrong? How can we proceed to do philosophy in this new environment? And the other thing I know Kenneth is he. I've not talked with this. I think when Socrates appears as a character in Plato, he is somewhat an existentialist in his questioning, his pointing, his use of common experiences and whatnot to make his points. Plato may have fallen too much into abstraction for Hegel and for Smith. I don't read those dialogues over and over like I read the ones that have Socrates showing you a man's character by interrogating him. That to me is where is the value of Plato. So yeah, Kenneth and I tussle a bit, but I don't think there's any ill will. And I don't think, I don't get the feeling that Plato turned me into a bad man or something like that because, oh, you read this stuff. But he might think that about, like you say, Augustine. You might think that about Aquinas and Aristotle. I know Aristotle seems more gnostic, more focused on real cases, you know. Huh?
Catafuse, according
Yeah.
to
Yeah, so, but certainly, you know, by the time Aristotle runs through Aquinas, I don't know that it's worth reading, you know. Yeah, I don't know how much. I used to go to these, there was a Catholic church near where I lived that had some real smart young priests there. And so on Sundays after Mass, I mean, I'm not Catholic, but they used to have a philosophical discussion. But it was medieval philosophy, you know, and sometimes there was a lot of tongue biting I had to do about, because I occasionally would, in frustration, just say, I think you're just totally misreading what Plato's writing, because you read it as if it were medieval idealism. Well, but never mind.
All right, okay, so the point is the Athenians couldn't figure out why they lost to the troglodytes. The Athenians had all the culture, they had all the silver mines, they had the navy, they had most of Greece eating out of their hands, and yet they still lost to the Spartan troglodytes. How could that be?
How, you know, that's probably something they asked themselves.
Yeah.
But strangely, they were defeated on the sea, not on the land.
That's the great ironic.
It's the Spartans who adapted.
Yes.
Not the Athenians.
How could the modern glorious West, with all its democracy and liberalism, lose against the Russian trogs?
Yes. Yes.
You know, I don't think I wouldn't say the Spartans or the Russians. The Spartans, you know, I think there are several good essays written about, are the Athenians more different from the Spartans or more similar? And it goes through the political systems of all the major cities. And it's true, I think, that Sparta is not kind of in the middle, it's to one end. But Athens is also not really in the middle. It's more off on the other end. And so they seem more different, but within the context of how polises in Greece organize themselves, they're both largely the same structure. So I think, in fact, one could say that as a land power, I think the Spartan phalanx was so good because the Spartans concentrated on dancing and singing and music, which let them have battlefield organization to keep everyone in sync. And that's another one of the things that just, to me, like you said, mind-boggling. You know, the Spartans like to dance. Now, they like to dance not because they enjoyed a good ballet, but because they liked a strong phalanx where thousands of men moved as one.
Right.
You know,
okay, that book you're talking about, that's another book I'd like to read.
Oh, yeah, I think that's one of Victor Davis Hanson's books on the Peloponnesian War. It's not a philosophical view of the Greeks. It's a military view because he's a military historian. So he talks about how they fought, not how pretty their statues were. Since I don't think there were statues in Sparta. There weren't.
Not so much.
Not so much.
All the money was flowing into Athens's bankers' coffers from the Delian League. Yeah, I guess, you know, Kenneth Smith would argue that U.S. is definitely not Athens. not only because we're modern instead of ancient, but also we conspicuously modeled ourselves on Rome instead. We did it on purpose. You know, our founding fathers talk about it a fair amount, that they thought Rome was more successful than Athens and they wanted to be successful, so they made us more Roman. And you can see that in the way that we have the same anti-intellectualism, we have the same anti-philosophicalism, we have the same approach to distorting our own history to glorify ourselves. There's any number of passages of Roman history and different Roman speeches where, you know, you could just swap in America and vice versa, and it reads, you can tell it's a cousin kind of speech, the way that they reason. But as far as the defeat, you know, being the evidence that we'd fallen, part of what I love about Thucydides' book, and it's a great read for anyone who hasn't read it. I mean, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, fantastically written. It's just great. He makes clear from very early on, back when the Athenians are being victorious and winning battles, he makes clear there's something seriously wrong. And it shows in the way that Athens, on the one hand, glorifies these great ideals and talks a good game right up until it's time to kick the ass of some city-state that sided with Sparta. And then, you know, it starts with a debate on the walls. And the city-state who's being besieged by Athens will say, look, aren't you the guys that stand for all these virtues? Which, you know, you flip back to the previous chapter and there's Pericles extolling those virtues. And you're like, well, I think these guys have an argument. And then Athens says, well, sure, but we're bigger and stronger than you are, so we're going to kick your ass because you chose poorly. You know, and it's Thucydides' way of saying, you know, even when they were winning, you could see the disease that had taken hold of Athens. And the disease was the class of people who were granted eristic privileges and rights within Athens did not exclusively contain aristoi. A large number of them were banausoi or douloi. Athens was being ruled by people who were not fit to rule. And the outcome of the Peloponnesian War is merely an unfortunate consequence of that. That the tragedy was, it happened somewhere before the book even starts. You know, his implication is something went wrong, as with Oedipus Tyrannus, something went wrong before this story began. And I'm going to show you the evidence of it, dialogue by dialogue, interaction by interaction, until, you know, you're a third of the way into the book and you're thinking, man, these Athenians are kicking ass. And yet somehow I'm not feeling good about this. I think something's wrong somewhere. You know, by the time you get to the end, when Athens is being defeated by the Spartan navy, which used to not be able to find its head with both hands, and now is, you know, swimming circles around the Athenians, it's a foregone conclusion that it had to come out that way.
You know, I think it's just a supposition of mine that Plato really assumed that anybody that read his dialogues had read Thucydides, because the people that are in the dialogues show up in Thucydides. You know, it's not, these aren't characters in a play. These are the real politicians, the real movers and shakers in Athens show up there.
Yeah.
You know, and you can go read. What were they like? You know, I think that's important. That's that context. Yeah. You know. Oh, I think people should read Thucydides. Yeah. And
yeah.
Well, I think Vladimir Putin is just a placeholder. He's not a real person. He's just a characteristic villain, which us, the glorious West, are destined to knock down, one after the other. We can't lose because we have all the right qualities. We're the good guys. We do all the good things. We believe our own nonsense, for starters.
And our military is as large as the next 22 country militaries combined.
So are the sea people really early Vikings that came down the Volga or whatever the rivers, the Danube, from Northern Europe?
I mean, my hypothesis.
They are the Rus. Maybe you're right, Stephen.
Right? They're
The sea
pirates and
people.
raiders, and they're the survivors of all the previous city-states that got sacked. You know, some of their responses to losing their city-states was to run off and join this growing pirate army. And soon, you know, it's like kill or be killed. I mean, if I can't be on the side that defeats the raiders, then I should become a raider. You know, there's this way in which it just sort of grew until it ate the entire Bronze Age civilization.
Well, the Vikings were a franchise that
Yeah.
spread their ideas. You know, as one guy was complaining, you had Irish Vikings who they said were even worse than the other Vikings.
Yeah.
I get this. I'm suspicious that the Sea People seem to have been a franchise that suddenly discovered how to build fairly serviceable boats. And they told all the other barbarians how to do it, and all the barbarians had boats. Where shall we go? Oh, Egypt. That's a nice place to go, isn't it? And, you know, they're all sailing down there, and, well, they're doing Egypt a favour because they're bringing timber. Egypt was always short of timber. And look, they're coming along, they're sailing along, bringing Egypt all this lovely timber that they're sailing in and dancing around on and waving their spears and swords and looking with great avarice at the Egyptian coast. But they were bringing timber, which Egypt needed.
Open the gates. We have a gift for you. You'll love it. Phil, tell us what's on your mind, and I'll go back to the text.
Yeah. I just want to ask Donald, because Donald's an expert in Plato, certainly much more than myself. You know, like I said, I've always said I love Plato, but you know, I have some problems with it in sense. And maybe Aquinas, Augustine was to be blamed, actually Plotinus more than Augustine. So if I saw Plato as really the forms were just an aspiration, then it's moving in the right direction. I think that's fine because that creates an openness to what the forms could become. But when he puts it in that actually is a memory that we have lost, it's about the retrieval of the forms that was already there. So that seemed like an answer rather than a question. The thing I have about Plato also with Socrates, and I believe Socrates is correct in the sense that, you know, the reason why I'm the wisest man is I don't really know anything, and therefore I have to question and find out what the hell it is. But when Plato wrote the dialogues, to the degree I've read it, is that Plato almost seemed to say, oh, yes, you do. It's not a question, because I always find Socrates, the Socratic method as sent in Plato, is like they were all leading questions. He knew all along how to get them to the answer that they would come to. So were those authentic questions, or were they leading questions that Plato made turn Socrates into? Because when it's a leading question, you're leading them to the answer. and, and they were following, oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Maybe it's this way. And then one step after another, they come to the conclusion. They didn't know what they were talking about. Now they understand a little bit better. So a true question, you don't know what the answers are. And I'm confused. Could you say something about that, Donald?
Well, I think it depends on who Socrates is talking to. If he's talking to, say, superstitious old man like Nicias, who led to the disaster at Syracuse as the general, well, he asked him leading questions about the general's art and the fortune teller's art. And who knew better how the battle would go? Well, Nicias is famous for he delayed his retreat for 30 days on the advice of his fortune teller and got his army slaughtered. I mean, clearly the questions sometimes are to reveal the character of who Socrates is talking to. Compare that to, say, the Theaetetus, where Theaetetus is a young boy, or young man, I think, but a mathematician, perhaps the leading mathematician later on in his life that in Greece at that time. And he's really, Socrates is like, wow, tell me about these irrational numbers and how they work and how you tell them and what's your theory about this. I mean, I don't think they're leading questions there. In the Republic, in chapter 1, when he's talking to Cephalus is an old man, got fabulously wealthy making shields during the war. But Adeimantus and Glaucon, the two cousins of Plato, are young guys that he hopes to, I think, steer into philosophy. In the Charmides, you have Charmides and his uncle or whatever, Critias. Critias led to 30. Charmides loves his uncle. You know, these are guys, this is, look, as children, these were villains. You know, they were foolish. You know, so unless you, that's part of the thing. I think reading Plato requires now so much historical work that it's impossible. That's one of the things. Like, I think I was fortunate. There was this positivism, whatever, positivism was a big English philosophy, was popular when I started studying school. And these people actually took the dialogues and laid them out as syllogisms, and then tried to see if the syllogisms were valid or not. And the chairman of the department, the same one that probably is vilified by Kenneth, was part of a movement to bring back the Greeks, bring back Plato. One of the projects I had there was going and studying every reference, every historical reference, and every dialogue in our Plato seminar to find out and what their story was. And it was a wonderful exercise for me. Not because anything ever came of it, but you find these things that, hey, it makes a difference. You know, that the battles that in there where Socrates says, oh yeah, we just came from the big rout at Delium, you know, or we were off at Amphipolis. These are all real events in the war, and you should read the military history in Thucydides or read what other military historians say about those battles and stuff, and Socrates' account and the characters in there. You'll learn things. And then you can read the dialogue, because every Greek in Athens that read that dialogue would have known that stuff. You know, it's like it makes a difference, since we know who Nixon was. If you wrote a play in which there was a character named Nixon and he says, I am not a crook, well, you would think that meant something. Not that he wasn't a crook, because you, like me, lived when Nixon was alive and remember him saying that. And it's just false, okay? So that's kind of stuff is happening all through Plato. And I don't know. I find it just fascinating. I always thought, well, gosh, I could collect all these thoughts, but no, I don't. I just talk to Phil about them or Rick or something. But that's that sort of concreteness, that characterology. I mean, and Kenneth is all about character. From Heraclitus, character counts. It's what men are. They are their character. Oh, Sharon, you want to tell me something? Straighten me out.
No, I'm just asking, is that part of the human predicament again? What they did back in the time of Plato, we're still doing now. Isn't that part of the human predicament? Yes? No? I'm asking.
Well, I think, not read. Yes. You have to know who you're dealing with. You have to understand character. You have to know the con man from the wise man. You know, maybe that's
how do you do that?
I don't know. Watch. Go get I think like some of the plays and movies by David Mamet about confidence men, like House of Games, or what's another one? American. I don't know, but they're all things in which nobody is what they appear to be. There's a Korean movie, The Parasite, I think, where nobody is what they. You watch this whole movie only to find out that it all a big con, you know, that nobody really is what character they are or what person they are.
That's what's interesting about watching The Sting, is that it inverts it. It's from the perspective of the con artists trying to create the situation that the victim is going to walk into and be duped by. And so by the time you actually get to the con, your perspective and his perspective are as far apart as they can possibly be, because you may think he deserves what's coming, but you know what he doesn't know, which is not a single person he's interacting with. It's who they seem to him to be. You know, and the lesson of The Sting is to go hand in hand with the David Mamet stories and say, now that you've learned that, turn it around and put yourself in the position of the dupe, because you know, you think you're out here talking to a world of friends who only have your best interests at heart, but the entire economic system is a con game. It's designed for exploitation. Right. And you know, if you enter a carnival where people's job is to pick your pockets and get your money, but you don't understand that's where you are, you're going to have a very different experience than if you know that's what you're up for, right? This is kind of Kenneth Smith's whole argument here, is going along with what Donald's saying.
Well, I think like in the Peloponnesian War,
yeah,
a lot of aristos got elected as strategos to be generals, and they were off up somewhere on the west coast of Greece, one of the early battles, trying to dislodge a small garrison of Spartans or something, and they kept screwing up. And one of the turning points, I think, is this guy Cleon, who is a tanner. He tans hides for a living. He's wealthy because it's a big business making leather and stuff like that. He says, well, you guys are a bunch of old fuddy-duddies. Give me some ships and some men, and I'll go up there and I'll rout them. You guys just don't know what you're doing. All this study to be a general and stuff, the general's art. Yeah. He won. He went up there and he did it. And I think, holy shit, you know, that's the end. That's all. To me, I looked at that and I said, oh, is this foreshadowing or something like that? This is like the end of the polis at Athens. Yes. It's now Now we see the businessmen, the Benoisoi, will rule this city. You know, because why? Well, they win. They win. It's not how they win, it's that they win. It becomes purely instrumental.
Yeah.
Well, enough. I've said enough. I should go back to.
It's been
Thank you, Donald. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. So let's see. I think we're going to finish this paragraph today. Let's continue on. But before I do, I want to point out that the last sentence that we previously said used the word nourishes. Logic nourishes nothing in the will or conscience. That's why I'm drawing the distinction between food and poison. Right? To distinguish what we should be doing from what we are doing or could be doing requires an understanding of what's healthy. And in any hyperlogos noetic system, healthiness is irrational. It's too fuzzy. It can't be pinned down what's healthy and what's not healthy. So what a hypernoetic system will do is instead give you a recipe for what is officially called health. And that's what it will target instead of your actual health. And if that doesn't describe your needs, and you wither on the vine as a result of being treated in that healthy way that the noetic people have prescribed for you, well, the problem isn't with the system because the system can't be wrong, right? We worship systems when we're hypernoetic. The problem must be you. There's something wrong with you. You're an anomaly, and we'll exclude you from the data set so that our data set is restricted to the people who flourish under our hypernoetic prescription for what counts as healthy. This is the difference between real health and noetic interpretations of health. So this issue of even the things that matter most in the life, like life or death or health or sickness, are difficult for a hypernoetic, hyperintellectual mind to get a grasp on. It can only handle an abstract version of them. And so as a result, logic says the most important thing is that you be valid. We're going to give you these rules of validity, and if you follow them, your reasoning will be valid. And that's the highest accolade. Look at how perfectly valid your logical syllogism is. Mwah! Brilliant. Now, the fact that you just reasoned that you should gather up all the undesirables and ship them off to concentration camps and thereby purify your society, the fact that that's a sick thing to want, that evaluation can't be made within the formal constraints of logic. Those are all irrational considerations. I mean, who's to say we shouldn't exterminate a bunch of people if it's good for our economy? That's just a matter of opinion, right? This is what the intellectual thinks. So each intellectual comes at it with their own idiosyncratic impulses, and the only thing that they can agree upon are the rules of validity. Or in the case of the legal system, what does the law say and what are the rules of precedent? Or in the case of the economy, what actually made money and what lost money? These are the things they can agree on. So this becomes the lingua franca for making decisions. And as a result, that becomes the priorities for these systems. They're not nourishing. If they nourish, it's as a sometimes side effect of what their real goal is. But they'll trample the interests of health and nourishing as often as they help them, because their real focus is something else. It's this ideological purity. Whichever ideology you've adopted, you try to make sure that you're following the rules of it. So this issue of sensitivity to questions of life and death and health versus sickness and so on, this is one of the places where Kenneth Smith repeatedly uses the language. Once you're sensitive to it, you'll see him repeatedly dropping little diction clues that life and being life affirming and health affirming is the thing that distinguishes, for example, a genuine myth from something that's not a myth but that we call a myth. The myth of the self-made man is not nourishing. It's not nourishing. Right? It's a kind of lie. There are some truths that it's attempting to impart, but it does it at the cost of imparting as many falsehoods as it does truths. But the myth of Oedipus Tyrannus, that is a myth, that is nourishing, that is warning us of something that we all have to be concerned about. That's a part of all of our lives. And if we can learn the lessons that Oedipus didn't learn until too late in the play, if we can learn them in advance, then we can head off a lot of unhealthy, sick behavior in ourselves. So the fact that it's health developing for our species and life developing for our species is what makes that a legitimate myth according to the ancient worldview. And the fact that countless other things that moderns call myths, like urban myths, have no such nourishing quality is what makes them pseudo-myths. They're not real myths. An ancient wouldn't call them a myth. They might be confused at first because we're using the word, but sooner or later they'd say, that can't be right. That I don't see where the life-giving qualities are. And to us, it seems arbitrary because we're not used to making this distinction between some myths are myths and some myths are not myths. We think any falsehood that's popular gets to be called a myth. We don't like to make the distinction, but that's because we've been acculturated to feel that distinguishing poison from food is wrong and you shouldn't do it. I mean, we buy it when it's really food, but on all these less tangible things that are every bit as important to our survival, we're taught not to make the distinction. We're taught that if you make the distinction, you're doing something subjective, arbitrary. Somebody else might have drawn the line somewhere else, and therefore it's not a real line, we say. As though the fact that an idiot can't distinguish what's healthy from what's not healthy should somehow be binding upon what's healthy versus what's not healthy. And therefore we're not supposed to be allowed to make distinction because an idiot can't make it. There is this praised disconnect from consequences that's built into the way that we make distinctions, and that we find ourselves resisting going along with the ancients and making the distinctions they want to make them. Because it feels like it's not playing by the rules. It feels arbitrary. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this really comes to the problem of, I previously talked about mathematical realism. Perhaps we're also constrained by linguistic realism in this sense. In other words, as human beings who have minds and we communicate with each other, we're subject to depend on language in one sense or another. Yet language, if it's made to be constraining, in other words, then in a sense we're oppressed by a kind of a system that constrains us into either a narrow channel or even often a long channel. And that really brings up the relationship with poetry and I guess analytical language, is that to what degree precision is important and to what degree of ambiguity is more important, because ambiguity detaches itself from the realism that it is. And I was thinking, that advertising, and I'm bringing this to a different dimension, advertising now has this really strong concept of branding. I remember when I was teaching in upstate New York, I was sitting in on a person who was teaching design, and he had a very, very simple first project. He brought a little tin to class, and he asked the people in the class, students in the class, to clip the tags off the dresses and the jeans and so forth. And they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. And he, at that point, just pointed out that the reality does not fit the system, right? Because it's not the pants, which is the real thing they're concerned with, is the damn label. Because the label is worth more than the pants. And they're not going to cut that off and put it in the tin and let them have it. Because he was trying to say that's not the essence of design, but it has become the essence because the branding of something. Now, I want to transition to a very, very specific thing I want to tell you. I might have told you that before. Because we have multiple languages throughout the world, having a single word that is known by just about anybody is a rare exception. Did you know that Coca-Cola is the second most known word in the world? That is a tremendous aptitude branding. And when you were talking about put it in your mouth and eat it, I thought of that immediately. It also had a lucky break because China at that time, 1.5 billion people. Coca-Cola is transliterated in Chinese, Coca-Cola. Po is mouth, like this. Ka, put it in your mouth, put it in mouth. The mouth feels good. Like hao la is like really good. Hao la. Put it in your mouth and your mouth tastes good. That's what it's translated in. Talk about the branding in that, right? Like I gotta go get myself, put it in my mouth and my mouth feels joy. Like talk about that. That is imprisoning you into a brand in a word that's become the most famous word in the world. The only other word that's more famous than that is okay. Everybody knows okay. Right? You could be in any country, you go to the market and you don't understand what he says, okay. Hand him some money, is okay. Okay. Right? Everybody knows that. To run second only to okay is a tremendous job of branding.
Yes.
And talk about the luck. Put it in your mouth and your mouth feels happy.
Yeah. That worked out for them well, didn't it?
Talk about that. You can say that about any drug. Put it in your mouth and your mouth feels happy, or your body feels happy. There you go.
Thanks, Phil.
So,
that's going to stick with me.
Be concerned about words.
Yes.
Used in the wrong way. That's it.
So as we read this stuff about myths, we need to be reading it from the perspective of that Kenneth Smith is judgmental, right? He's judgy. He's value forward. In some of his other essays and parables, he talks about the fact that people go after him. Other philosophers go after him for not being distanced enough, for not being intellectual and objective and cool enough, that he's too hot, he's too warm, he's all full of these judgments in your face. But part of his argument is that the whole idea that it's more objective to not make judgment calls is an illness in us. It's not something to aspire to, right? Because not making distinctions between what's healthy and what's not healthy is how you end up sick, right? That's a recipe for trouble. That's a recipe for nuclear bombs. That's how you end up, with concentration camps, by saying, let's not worry about these little differences. Let's just talk about who can effectively get the job done, right? So when he talks about myth, he's always talking, the word is always laden with this value judgment in the ancient Greek. And in this, he's trying to emulate the ancient Greeks by saying this was the purpose of myths is to do this thing. If it's not doing that thing, it's not a myth, even if everybody calls it one. Even if it's in the title. You buy a book called The Myth of Blank, it still doesn't mean that it's a myth. Even though the guy was such an expert, he could write an entire book about it, you still have to question whether that counts as a myth. Is this the right way to use the language? So throughout chapter 4, anytime he talks about myths, we know we're talking about not the modern concept of a myth, but the ancient concept of a myth. That is a health-giving bit of judgment that wraps lessons about deep principles in an unforgettable anthropomorphized story. So like a parable, myth is a mode of culture attuned an entire people to roughly the same issues and perspectives. Now, I'll go on to the rest of the sentence later, but let's start there in a moment. So the purpose of myth is to get us not going after each other and not heading off every which way. It's to end the running in sand sensation where the culture can't achieve anything because everything we do is undoing what the other guy's doing, right? Like Democrats and Republicans in the US. Every new administration they spend the entire administration undoing everything the previous administration did. And it's, you know, it's nothing. You can't get anything done. It would be better if it didn't exist, because at least then it would be free. You know, it's like we pay an enormous amount of money to get nowhere in America. So, you know, the ancients recognized that this problem of the human condition, this problem that we lack the innate intelligence of animals, in that we don't know what's good for us, and we aren't aligned into a long-term survival orientation where we could do anything, including things that are very, very bad for us. And the purpose of culture is to help us. We could still do a diversity of things, but we want to get some common ground about, you know, the things that are healthy, and about not preying on each other. You know, we can compete with each other, but it's supposed to be a constructive competition that eggs each other on to higher and higher heights, like the Olympic Games. Not, you know, I break into your house and eat your food every time you go off to work. That's destructive competition. So the goal here is the myth is about more than affecting an individual. It's about trying to align a culture. And you can see that with the way that the Greeks used their Olympian religion, which they were busy constructing consciously to try to make it an instrument of anthropoculture, cultivating human beings. So attuning an entire people to roughly the same issues and perspectives. Well, as you remember, perspective is one of our key words for this entire work. This is a whole book about learning to see the world from more than the modern perspective. So this is an allusion back to the whole purpose of the book. And he says, in the form of existential imperatives. Now, imperatives means it's not objective. It's not cautiously describing reality and then leaving it up to you to make of it what you will. It's an imperative. It's what we should be doing in order to survive as a people. What should we be doing? What should we all be doing? What should we share in common? What understandings and perspectives should we have in common that affect our behavior? This is what myths are for, is to orient us in those ways. And you have to put this together with the previous section where they were talking about the way that the educate people was focused on this idea that everybody has their own individual arete, which are different from everybody else. So we're not, unlike the modern world with No Child Left Behind, where we're trying to produce clones who can all pass the same tests with the same grades. The ancient world, despite the fact that they're trying to engineer the entire culture to get us coherent, their goal is not to do that by cloning. They're not trying to create duplicate Xeroxed human beings. They're trying to create people who can simultaneously have completely different strengths and have educations that allow each of them to develop those distinctive strengths in their own distinctive directions to become as great as they can at the different things that they can do. And yet, we share a common set of principles and myths. And the myths teach us the principles. And so what we do with those gifts, the gifts differ, the people differ, but what we do with our differing gifts is aligned. That's the function that myths are trying to provide. So this is something deeply fundamental. This goes well below the choice of a political system. But regardless of which political system you adopt, and the Greeks had a lot of different political systems and their different polises, and this is something that Aristotle writes about. Regardless of that, they should be grounded, according to the Greeks, in these same fundamental myths that help us to understand the limits and liabilities of the human character. What are our possibilities for good or ill, and how can we try to avoid the worst outcomes and kind of lean into the better outcomes? That's what's going on here. The Greeks are inserting myth at this deep level in their society. This isn't something you go and listen to on Sundays to pass the time or to try to make yourself a better person. This is something that has to permeate everything, everywhere you go. And you can see that with the way that the Athenian Agora has the statues of the charities right there in plain sight of all of the traders. No matter how hard you're working to get a better deal than the guy you're dealing with, there they are looking at you, and they're divine. They have authority over you, and they're reminding you that the purpose of the marketplace is for us all to come together. and for us all to succeed as a community. So constructive competition, not destructive competition. You're not trying to maximize this quarter's returns. You're trying to maximize this quarter's returns within a framework of health and not go beyond that. It's the myths that establish the boundaries beyond which you won't go. And by so doing, this makes absolutely crystal clear that the ancient perspective is not the same as the modern perspective. Because the modern perspective is there's no such thing as enough. More and more and more, grow and grow and grow. There's always more to be had. And however much there is, I should have all of it. The perfect outcome for my company is that this quarter's returns are infinite. And the closer to that I can get, the more I've succeeded. This is an alien perspective from the ancient perspective. And you can see how, from the ancient perspective, they would look at the way we interact and say the missing ingredient is you guys don't have any myths. And because you don't have any myths, you don't understand how the pursuit, these one-sided, unbalanced pursuits are going to turn your virtues into vices and get you into trouble. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to call on Sharon, who had her hand up, even though she just took it off, because I'm really curious to see what she had to say. But she'd have to come off mute for that to work. Hi.
I just want to make sure that I understand this. So myth is not a precursor of logos. It's not. Yes?
Yeah, like logos is an aspect of myth. And if we lean too hard into logos, we only do that by stripping away the rest of myth. All the value-laden stuff gets stripped out, and we're left with all the meansy practical stuff that tells us how to be strong and powerful and effective, but doesn't tell us what we ought to do with those powers. Myth is when you take all those capabilities, but you combine them back into the matrix of values that says, what should we do or not do? And how do we remember that?
Because this one sentence here, which I am going to commit to memory, it says, like a parable, myth as a mode of culture attuned an entire people to roughly the same issues and perspectives in the form of essential imperatives.
Yes.
Whereas logos culture leaves each thinker an isolated nomad, void of help or support in grasping any essential principles.
Yes.
So in terms of functionality,
Yes.
myth is a functional entity.
Yes.
Myth is what guides the individual and the society.
That's right.
Okay,
It's
I
like
got it.
It's like a critical organ of culture, that without which we can't function effectively. Or more importantly, we function effectively but not wisely without myth. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
So to use the modern term of the myth of Atlantis, not the ancient term, what the myth of Atlantis is warning us about is what happens to a culture without myth. They had all this power, but they did the wrong things with it. They didn't know where their limits should be. And so they did themselves in and sank the entire continent, which of course, Plato, it's all these people hunting for Atlantis today are missing the fact that in the dialogue, Plato says, I'm going to invent a myth. I'm gonna invent a story from scratch. This is absolutely false. He more or less says, I'm just gonna make this up. He says, I'm not basing this on something that happened. I'm trying to illustrate a deeper principle here. So let me just invent this idea of an entire continent of people. And they were so smart and so powerful that they could change the world. And unfortunately, they lacked myth. And so they lacked wisdom. And they used their power so badly, they sank an entire continent. You could see how he could derive that from their own history. Our great heroic age had all these virtues, but without wisdom, they trashed the entire Bronze Age. They caused the Dark Age, right? I mean, the myth of Atlantis is just a restatement of what the Greeks had already experienced. So that's what they're warning about. Without myth, we're in serious trouble. Because it's myth that reminds us to curb our pride. It's myth that reminds us that that more power is often exactly what we don't need. What we want to do is have the amount of power available to us be titrated to our capacity to handle it and to whether the problem at hand calls for it. You know, I know, Sharon, you in a hospital environment, you deal with this issue that, you know, it's natural for each kind of specialist doctor to come to feel like they have all the answers. If you would just let them at the patient, they could fix this problem. And, you know, when it's a surgeon with a scalpel, it's a little scary. It's like there are certain problems where by all means bring on the surgeon, but you know, this guy, maybe he just needs some counseling. He just needs someone to listen to him for a while, and maybe bringing a knife to the picture is not going to help. But to, you know, what does the saying say in a hospital? To the problem with surgeons is that every person looks like they're covered in dotted lines. Cut here. This is how you dissect this or that. So yeah. So yeah, that's my long-winded answer to your short, direct, very important question. Just that's the purpose of myths from an ancient perspective. It's so that it's not trying to do what the modern world does, where it's not trying to prescribe everything we ought to do. It's just trying to give us some of the main reference points. What are the main 12 to 24 ways that people tend to go wrong? And trying to make it so that everybody knows those same things. So as a culture, if we're going to make mistakes, and we will, at least they won't be those mistakes, right? It's like there's a frame to our picture. There's certain mistakes we can avoid most of the time if we all share those myths. That's kind of the idea. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so when dear old Trumpy got elected, the night he got elected, I was going to visit some Liberal friends at a restaurant meeting, and I get there and they're already there, and they all look at me with sad looks on their faces. And I hardly ever follow the news, and they said, "Your hero Trump has won." I go, "Oh, that's nice." Sit down. They'll say the first thing us fascists are going to do is cut back education to 8 years. Now, you could condemn me for liking Donald Trump, fair enough. I could be wrong. You can condemn me for wanting to cut back education to 8 years. I could be wrong. But anyway, there was a mother and son there, and the son's a school teacher. And he turns around to me, he's a smart guy. How can there be such a thing as too much education? And boy, this is where we're going. This is where you can have too much education. What are you going to do? Put the entire population in school their entire life? I can't see how that works. There has to be a balance. And it seemed to be like he was using the quantity argument. I mean, does quantity of education beat quality of education? And I'm just amazed that people are missing these points. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Phil and then Sharon. Tell us what's on your mind, Phil.
Oh, hold on. Okay. I just wanted to respond to Stephen, if Phil would let me.
Go ahead.
Because this is a real pet peeve of mine, right? There are phases in my career when I was an educator, and I would throw away that word education and I would substitute learning. If we would teach kids how to learn, there is no time limit on education. And that's until the society can correct that misconception. You put the kid in the classroom and you give them the test. That's not education. The system needs to find a way to build a level of curiosity into the child for those who require it. And then there's no time limit on it. One of the features of my personality, I think life is exciting because I'm always learning something. But my father taught me that. That's the system of education in which I came up. So 8 years means nothing. It's continuous. And so if we could just change that word, education, to teaching a child to learn, appreciate wonder, the wonder of life, and really honor his or her existence, then we wouldn't have this problem. And if that sounds too high in the sky, maybe it is, but you got to start someplace. Thank you, Phil.
Well, and that's how education used to work, right? Children were integrated into society originally. And so, they had to learn to love to learn because they weren't going to be segregated from society and put in a little school building for 12 years or, 16 years or whatever. So the fact that we do this kind of isolation of children from society is what creates the problem that Sharon and Stephen are both talking about. At some point we have to be engaged with life. And so you got to hope that by the time we get engaged with life, somebody has taught us to love to learn, or, cultivated that in us to reward us for it and make us keep going and keep seeking out information. But anyway, thank you for that. Phil, go ahead, and then we'll go back to the text.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about that too, but I had a different point to make, but I'll just say something about briefly. I remember about maybe a year and a half ago, I think Jenny complimented you that you were an authority and all this stuff. And I just sort of made a slightly snide remark and said, no, don't say that. And you actually kind of got a little bit miffed about that. And I said, no, the reason why I said that is because I didn't like the context that had something to do with being an authoritarian. And you're the least authoritarian teacher that I've ever met. So in that sense, so maybe it was misapplied, but I thought that's really the difference between learning and education, that you're not authoritarian. So yeah, I'll just stop there and I'll get to my other point. Well, you also have to be a little bit careful about myth too, because I think there is well, maybe it's not a contemporary, but a modern myth that about America that was truly driving, but it also was a mishap. I mean, the myth of manifest destiny. I mean, when you look at it in one sense, it's not a fairy tale. It actually was something that drove America, and pretty much everybody, except the ones that were on the wrong side of it, sort of agree that it was destiny that we would move from coast to coast, and America would be a complete, nation of its own in some sense. Now, of course, we trample. I mean, the bad part is that we trample on a lot of people, but that is a myth. I mean, it's not like fairy tale. It was a myth that actually drove America for manifest destiny. So you have to be careful about how you put out the myth as well, because it could be also very destructive in its own way. I'm not saying that it wasn't good also in one sense, but it was also, we have to be careful how we manifest the manifest destiny. Let's put it that way. So I think that is a myth. I mean, that's a myth in the old sense, that there was something that we all strove for. And that was the transcontinental railroad and all that stuff. So what do you say about that myth? Is that is that a modern myth that doesn't qualify as a myth, or is that just like a slightly off color myth that actually was real? So and in fact, that was enforced by the whole tradition of the cowboy movie, right? I mean, we conquered those damn Indians. The only good Indians are dead Indian, that kind of thing. And now we backtrack and we realize that was a mistake, but that really drove the destiny of America in some sense. Yeah. So what do you say about that myth?
It's a great question. And it's a great choice to try to distinguish what an ancient myth is from a modern myth, right? Because, an ancient myth has to be nutritious. So I guess you have to ask the question, is genocide nutritious? Is it nutritious to teach a people to, exterminate as many people as they can and spread as far as they can, and to tell them that they can do no wrong because God has chosen them, and that God has given them permission to ignore moral laws like, not murdering entire peoples. And go ahead and do it. God wants you to. God wants you to have all this. God meant you to take it all. Is that nutritious? Is it healthy to feed the ego of a people that way? And amplify it. And generally speaking, if we look at most myths that would be recognized as myths by the ancients, what we find is the opposite. We find them warning us against the dangers of overweening pride, of too much hubris. And what is Zeus? The Greeks have hardly any commandments at all, but Zeus's one commandment is the guest rights, that the host must not abuse the guests. You're to treat each other like human beings, not like natural resources to be harvested. And that somebody who kills and eats other people is committing, a terrible crime according to the Greek gods. So killing and eating the resources of the people who inhabited this continent so that we could have it is a violation of Zeus's most profound commandments. Basically, there's no way to read Manifest Destiny as a cautionary tale that will help us to behave better and help us to, to thrive. The fact that we put it in our mouth and swallowed it doesn't make it food. It was useful to us, like a lot of things that are bad for us are useful to us. I think about those Nazi soldiers hopped up on speed during World War II. This is another thing they don't teach in elementary school. It's like, how did they do all those blitzkriegs and amazing military campaigns? Well, they and all their commanders and their political leaders were hopped up on amphetamines. They were basically, they had and cocaine. They had bad judgment. And would anybody say that the gains that they made for a few years were worth the long-term consequences to Germany? I mean, most people would say that was a sickness that was adopted because it was short-term useful, but it was long-term unhealthy. So these are tough things, distinguishing between what's healthy and what's not healthy. It's tricky, but what we find usually is that most of the things that we want to adopt as myths in the modern world are not actually healthy for us. They might seem like it because of their short-term utility value, but the long-term consequences tend to be disastrous.
Well, don't you have to ask a question, to what degree are you going to harmonize? Are you going to harmonize the whole world? You're going to harmonize just like, quote, the white population that's trying to conquer the thing? I mean, it's like the limits begin to be a thing. And that's the same question I asked about the city. I mean, the city, is it supposed to build a structure that differentiates itself from nature, would seem to have some success, but on the other hand, it has certain failures now that we know of. So how do you harmonize that? I mean, do you just harmonize with the city, or do you harmonize with the city and nature as well? I mean, it's like, the question is where the limits are in terms of the harmony. Because I think it's difficult to think we're going to harmonize with, let's say, Andromeda, even though we know it's there. It's like, so I think you have to draw the limits, and the problem with the limits is, in some sense, it has the smell of excluding the boundaries in a funny way, just like the borderlines are. So,
well, this is an example of where the difference between an heuristic evaluation and a pragmatic evaluation. A pragmatic evaluation says, hey, Manifest Destiny won us a continent, so how bad could it be really? And then it encourages us to do math with human beings and say, this many millions of modern Americans benefit, and this many millions of indigenous people suffered, and let's do a simple subtraction problem. It tries to reduce health to arithmetic. And in fact, it doesn't reduce that way. When people who acculturate themselves to behaving with enormous cruelty towards other people, even a minority, it breaks them inside. The Nazis noticed this. They would put together these German firing squads who were there to exterminate Slavs as they rolled across Eastern Europe, and they just line up the Slavs in front of they make the Slavs dig mass graves, and they line them up in front of them, and then they just machine gun or rifle them all down so their bodies would fall into the graves to simplify the process, of exterminating the Slavs and moving east. And what they found was the Germans tended to break down with mental health problems, even though they had been swallowing the indoctrination about how these are subhuman people and that they have a manifest destiny to spread east, in which Hitler modeled on our manifest destiny to spread west. He wanted Europe to spread east and take over all the Slavic lands. Nevertheless, despite the fact that they believed it as hard as they could possibly believe it, it broke them to do these things. We're not made to slaughter each other. And this is something that you see, for example, in the Navajo enemy way and ghost way ceremony, especially the enemy way, that even if what you did in war was heroic, even if it had to be done to save your people, even if it was good in all the other ways, when you come home, you're still broken, and you have to go through a ceremonial, and the entire community has to join in to help you recover from the way that you've harmed yourself by engaging in this behavior, right? And the people who come home from war are the most likely to have problems with domestic violence, problems with anger management, problems with suicide, problems with alcoholism. I mean, all kinds of self-destructive and community destructive behaviors flow from having done the things that they did. And they know it. The Navajo know it, and that's why, and they've known it for at least centuries, maybe thousands of years, which is why they have these ceremonials. Their whole society is designed around, sometimes you have to do evil. Sometimes the world forces you into circumstances where you must do an evil thing, but it doesn't become a good thing just because you had to do it. And you still have to deal with the consequences, and it's going to be a lot of work. Now, we had no such wisdom attached to our approach to manifest destiny, and neither did the Nazis. When the Nazis rolled east, when we rolled west, we weren't bringing people back after they did these horrible crimes and coming together as a community and helping them to psychologically heal so that they could be fit to exist in the society. We just dumped them on the society. And massive, widespread problems of all the things that I said before, and murder, those plague our cities to this day. Similar studies have been done on police officers in the United States. We don't give them the mental health support that they need to do the things that they do. And as a result, anger management and domestic violence and suicide are higher on average among police officers and ex-police officers than they are among the general population. These things aren't just supposedly rhetorically bad because somebody else is hurt when we kill them. They're also bad for us. And of course, finally, there are these much more complex long-term consequences that we can't foresee. So, was it good for us that the way that we lived resulted in all the old growth forest being gone now? All of it? Was it good for us that we over harvested the Columbia River until salmon were almost gone and smelt were almost gone? Was that good? Are these good circumstances that we have? Or would it have been better for us if, our learning about the land and spreading across the land had happened more slowly, so that we had a chance to raise our wisdom to match our power, so that we could make better decisions about what we did? We basically are the heirs to centuries of bad behavior by our ancestors. And, most of the major problems we deal with in the world today are things that have been handed down to us. So, that's also part of manifest destiny. It's not just a simple equation of, well, we got what we wanted and yay. I suppose it's not good. So the question about harmonization, it's not as simple as kumbaya and should we all hold hands. It's also the deeper hidden harmony. What are the more complex consequences of our actions? And the bigger the action that we take, the larger the freight of unintended consequences that we're going to suffer in the years ahead.
I'll just say one more thing. It just seems like the problem is that we all live and we all die. Our lives are short. So therefore, that which belong properly in myth it's really kind of subconscious to the soul. And so therefore we live in a sense to what we could see rather than in a sense ask the voice within us that's part of the soul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great question, Phil. I mean, Manifest Destiny is a great example. Thank you. Sharon and then Stephen, and then we'll wrap up for today. Go ahead, Sharon.
Very quickly, I think one of the attributes of myths is that they're motivators. Manifest Destiny is a motivator. God and country, and this is what you're going to do for your country. The other thing that Phil talked about, which I find very interesting, whenever you have a system and a process and you put it in place, you never quite know where it's going to end up because it's continuous. And I think back to my early science days when you had to imagine that all these little gas particles were in the speaker and you never know what was going to come. They were in constant motion and everybody's gas container settled out differently. Well, I think that's how life is. Once you set a system and process in place, harmony is different each time. And that's just my perception of it. And there is no such thing as perfect, and maybe I'm wrong, perfect, complete harmony. It's always evolving.
Right. Yeah, these are complex issues. Harmony is a short word to mean so much. It means very complicated things. It's like the word science. It's short, but oh my God, it just goes on in the complexity, and the details matter. The complexities matter. And it's the same with harmony. This issue of myth, again, we come back to this question. So from the ancient perspective, even if it motivates people, it's not a myth unless it motivates them in a healthy direction as a people. If it motivates them in an unhealthy direction, then it is to myth as saccharin is to sugar. It's a carcinogen that happens to hit the same receptors and give people, it temporarily satisfies the same cravings. But the difference is if all you eat is saccharin, it's not going to end well for you. Granted, it's not going to be great if all you eat is sugar, but we're trying to make this distinction between the healthy and the unhealthy here. The language problem is so big that not only have we replaced the original definition of the word myth with something that doesn't help us to make this distinction, even if we had the original word myth, we would still be missing the other word. What is a word for a thing that looks and acts like a myth, but it makes you sicker if your people adopts it? Well, I don't know that the Greeks ever had a word for that. And then what is the general word that covers both things, the things that resemble each other, that we crave and can't always distinguish between? But it really is important to distinguish between them because one will make us healthier and the other will make us sicker. Well, I don't know. We don't have a word for that either. And I don't know that the Greeks did either. So this is going to be a recurring problem in this area of philosophy. The very most important things to talk about. Either those words have been redefined to not mean what they used to mean, and we've lost those definitions, or we never had words for those in the first place. And so we're sort of feeling our way in the dark, trying to make distinctions without words to help us. It's tough. It's a tough problem. Stephen, and then we'll go on, then we'll be done.
Hey, on the question of Donald Trump, I was mystified by his persona initially, and I thought, well, what a weird character. But suddenly I realised, I look back in the history, and if you were to go back to the 19th century, it was a very standard sort of persona. Every American town, you'd walk to a street corner, you'd find a Donald. Same sort of very verbose persona. Now, I'm not saying he's bad or good. I don't know. I don't know the answer there. I only noticed, I thought this was a rare bird, and maybe he is a rare bird today, but you go back a century or so, and the world was full of Donald Trumps.
A very
Well,
common.
it certainly is not good, Stephen. That's for certain.
That's a different.
I don't know whether he's good or bad, because all humans
Stephen,
might
come
be.
on.
All humans might be bad. I think that maybe Mother Nature might think humans are a bad contagion on the earth. Mother Nature is better off without. Who knows? Who knows?
Don't be upset, Stephen. I'm sorry, but don't be upset.
Well, on this note, we're going to wrap up for today.
Okie dokie. Let's wrap up.
I'm just going to point out the proclamation of 1763. If you want to talk about the question of manifest destiny, again, I don't know who's right or wrong. Maybe the manifest destiny people were right, but there was the other side of the argument before they made that argument, and the British authorities were well aware of the moral situation regarding the Indians up to the Mississippi, which was now British territory. They knew that the moral thing was to look after the interests of what, after all, were British subjects, even if they were Indians. So it was no new discovery that they'd done something which was possibly wrong. I don't know the answer there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Fascinating stuff at the very tail end of the meeting, but we'll have to pick it up next week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
Have a great week.
Bye-bye.